Chapter 338. Xianxia was a serious Taoist Longhu, but when he arrived at Mount Wudong and stayed there for a long time, he was also greatly harmed by Hong Xixiang. He was either dragged to repair the temple or chopped firewood and burned charcoal to build a bamboo house. During this period, it was inevitable that he would bump into several generations of Taoists of Wudong. At first, the Taoist children of Wudong's younger generation did not have a good expression on their faces. Later on, when they saw this Taoist from Mount Longhu, although he always had a straight face as if they owed him tens of thousands of strings of coins, his heart was not bad. In addition, the young martial granduncle who was also the chief treated him with respect. Furthermore, when the Taoist children heard that this fellow's swordsmanship was on par with their sixth martial granduncle's, the bolder ones plucked up the courage to ask him about the flying sword Dharma. Xianxia was also generous and did not have any prejudice against his family background. He answered all questions. In the end, a large group of Taoist children who admired the sword Immortal's elegance and the Jianghu's reputation followed behind him and chattered non-stop. The remote bamboo house that Xianxia lived in also became a lot livelier. Unlike Mount Longhu, which had countless golden rules and jade rules, Mount Wudong did not pay much attention to them. Xianxia originally thought that he would be very uncomfortable. Unexpectedly, not to mention those mischievous and naive Taoist children, even a few of his senior brothers who rode bulls, Qinzhao, Song Jiming, Yu Xingrui and the others had indifferent interactions with him. Unknowingly, Xianxia lost some of his original intention to compete with the bull riders. He calmed his mind and practiced swordsmanship on Mount Wudong. Occasionally he would go to the Taishu Temple on the main peak to admire the sunrise and sunset. Looking into the distance, the 72 peaks in the four directions were like lotus petals protecting the main peak. Together they presented a posture of worship. Every time he finished his breathing exercises and retracted his gaze, Xianxia could not help but look at the celestial sword that was left behind by ancestor Lu. It hung under the eaves of the great gung. Xianxia had a lot of respect for ancestor Lu, who had not appeared in the world for 500 years. Otherwise, he would not have wholeheartedly practiced swordsmanship and pursued the ultimate sword technique of taking the head of an enemy from 1,000 miles away. In Taoism there were two types of swordsmanship. Since ancient times, Daoist swordsmanship was respected. Simply put, Daoist swordsmanship cut off the 7 emotions and 6 desires, while Daoist swordsmanship cut off demons and evils. The former was beneficial for cultivation and had no harm, while the latter was unavoidably tainted by karma. There was once a heavenly master of Mount Longhu who had encountered a rare heavenly tribulation because of this and almost died on the spot. If not for Mount Longhu's prompt decision to sacrifice a few dragon pool lotus of fortune as the price, the consequences would be unimaginable. Mount Longhu did not have any objections and regrets when Xianxia walked the path of Daoist swordsmanship. Today was the birthday of Yujing God Zhenwu the Great Emperor. There was an endless stream of pilgrims who went up the mountain to burn incense. Speaking of which, it was strange. Ever since the person who rode the bull took over as the chief, although there were no immortal deeds like the previous chief, Wang Zhongluo, who could break a river with one finger, and this person with the surname Hong did not even leave the mountain once, the incense on Mount Wudong was getting more and more prosperous. Xianxia often listened to his fellow disciple Bai Yu talk about fate and knew a thing or two about it. He observed the clouds and the clouds at the main peak. It should be known that Wudong was located in the northwest of the continent, and the fate of the world had always flowed from the west to the east, like a rolling river flowing to the sea. However, in this period of time even Xianxia, who was a layman, could vaguely see the sea of clouds surging and gathering outside the 72 peaks. It was just that he did not know when it would accumulate and erupt. Fortunately, Xianxia was never willing to worry unnecessarily. Whether or not Xuanwu would rise, whether or not Longhu would prosper, who was the real Taoist ancestral court, who was bestowed with the title of king by the imperial court, none of these were important to him. Xianxia's heart suddenly jumped and his eyes widened. He raised his head and looked at the celestial sword that had not been unsheathed for a full 500 years. This ancient sword that had been silent for 1,000 years after Lu Zhu ascended to immortality was actually trembling like a dragon. The sea of clouds on the 72 peaks boiled and finally, like 72 white dragons swimming towards the main peak. Hundreds of yellow cranes soared and circled. The vast number of pilgrims who flocked to the mountain for the birthday of Zhenwu the Great Emperor raised their heads almost at the same time to see this strange phenomenon. No one knew who shouted that Zhenwu the great emperor had appeared, but tens of thousands of fearful pilgrims knelt on the ground together. If you told the ordinary people in the world about the saints' scriptures, mysterious morals and profound Buddhism, it would not be of much use to them. They usually liked and feared things that were shallow and obvious, just like the ordinary people who saw the swords, spears and sticks in the hands of the ruffians, or the embroidered patchwork clothes and palanquins of the officials. Therefore Buddhism had the 18 hells, which scared people and made them tremble in fear. Taoism had all kinds of Zhenren and immortals to save the world and help the people. These things were often disdained by the scholars and masters, but to the ordinary people in the streets and alleys, it was the most frightening thing. After the death of the Big Dipper Lord, Zhenwu the great emperor took charge of Wudong and issued edicts to the north. In its heyday, countless pilgrims from the south would come to Wudong to burn incense and pray for blessings. Now Wudong's reputation was waning, but most of the people in the north still believed in it. Especially with the sea of clouds rolling overhead and the yellow cranes crying together, who would not worship it as if it were a god? Qin Yao, who was looking for an ancient book in the Sutra Tower, staggered to the window and opened it with trembling lips and tears running down his face. Senior brother Wang, little brother has succeeded. Song Jiming, who was refining pills in the mountains, did not care about the pills that were regarded as immortal objects by ordinary people. He fell to his knees and kowtowed. Wudong's 36th disciple Song Jiming welcomes the founder. Yu Xingrui, who had found a disciple who was in seclusion in the East Sea, was sitting on a cushion and teaching the disciple the Nigong Heart Sutra. He clapped his hands and laughed until tears came out of his eyes. He said excitedly, "Li Yufu, your uncle master is finally coming down the mountain." 72 peaks faced the summit and 24 streams flowed. Among them, the longest waterfall was lifted and straightened as if it was assisted by the gods. It led to the adjacent Little Lotus Peak where only a young Taoist practiced the way of the heavens. The waterfall was like a white chain across the sky. When the tens of thousands of pilgrims saw this scene, they felt as if they were in a fairyland. It was even quieter. The huge Wudong mountain was so quiet that you could almost hear a pin drop. Who was the one who built the bridge? Xianxia saw the ancient sword fly out of the Taishu temple with its scabbard. It followed the sword and flew along the water bridge hanging between the two peaks to Little Lotus Peak. He saw the person riding the ox and leaning against the tortoise camel tablet. He muttered to himself, "Today is the day to interpret the lot. It's best to go to Jiangnan." The immortal ancient sword flew around the young chief, as if it was reuniting with an old friend. It was happy and excited. Xianxia, who was excited, shouted, "Hong Xixiang, who are you? Why is Ancestor Lu's sword connected to you?" The young martial granduncle on the ox turned a deaf ear. He was in a daze. He pinched his fingers and calculated again. After a long time he exhaled and smiled at Xianxia. He slowly got up and stroked the ancient sword that was suspended in the air. He touched it with his finger and the 3-foot sword was as clear as water. The scabbard separated and he said softly, "You go to Jiang and you go to Longhu. I'll be there soon." The scabbard went to Longhu Mountain and the sword flew towards Jiangnan. The ancient sword went down the mountain first. Hong Xixiang, who was wearing a plain Taoist robe, patted the dust off. He rode a huge yellow crane and looked towards Jiangnan. "Jiangnan is good. It's best if it's a red coat." Xianxia looked up at the yellow crane and said in shock, "Ancestor Lu?" Xianxia was originally shocked to the extreme, but when he saw the yellow crane return, the guy who was no longer riding an ox hastily jumped off. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Let's go greet the senior martial brothers first before leaving the mountain." "Oh right, Brother Qi, I'll have to trouble you to take care of the Taoist children's studies." Even the inflexible Xianxia couldn't help but want to swear. What kind of immortal is this? The newly appointed headmaster, who had never walked out of the Black Tortoise Dang Xing Memorial Archway when he was young, was scolded by His Highness as a coward. He finally had the guts to go down the mountain. It was a natural wonder. The Taoist rode the yellow crane into the distance. The yellow crane shuttled through the clouds and flew past the northwest city of Fish Dragon Pass. It was majestic. The pass locked the Yin border and the defense line was continuous. It was one of the choke points of the empire's north desert. Some soldiers climbed up the city and looked into the distance. Who was the first to see the yellow crane? There seemed to be another person sitting on the back of the crane. There was someone. There really was one person. This news immediately spread like wildfire. The soldiers at the border all rushed to the commanding heights of the city wall. Sure enough, they saw an immortal who looked like a Daoist riding a crane to the east. The impregnable pass in the northwest immediately exploded. When the yellow crane whistled over their heads, everyone looked up blankly. They didn't dare to say anything for fear of disturbing the celestial who was free and unfettered in the sky. In the prosperous Central Plains, there was a yellow crane tower standing on the banks of the great river. Its wings and horns were rugged and heroic. There was once an immortal poet who left a famous poem that was handed down from generation to generation. It was said that 500 years ago, Zhou Xian from Guanxi cultivated for 200 years and finally became an immortal. He swore that if there was injustice in the world he wouldn't be willing to ascend to the heaven. He traveled leisurely in the mortal world with poetry, swords and wine. He once rode a crane past this tower, causing purple clouds to rise from the east. There were more than 300 famous poems from different dynasties and generations on the walls of the tower. Today, a grand poetry gathering was held upstairs. The scholars of the Central Plains were in the mood for wine and poetry. Suddenly, they heard that a magical yellow crane flew from the west to the east. They all came to the corridor to watch. When they got closer, they suddenly realized that there was an immortal sitting on the crane. The immortal's style was not inferior to Lu Dongshuan's in the past. The scholars and poets looked at each other in disbelief. Was there really an immortal on land in the world? Chapter 339. 500 years ago he left on a crane. 500 years later he returned on a crane. In the vast expanse of mist, the yellow crane flew across the yellow crane tower. An old scholar said in a daze, "I have witnessed this scene. My life was not in vain." Jiangnan. Old people, old scenes, old memories. The autumn wind rose, autumn leaves fell, people gathered and parted, autumn crows perched and startled, missing each other and not knowing when they would meet again. This scene was embarrassing. The beautiful peonies of Baogua Temple withered one after another. In the autumn season, there were still some 100-year-old osmanthus to be admired. The trees were old, the branches were evergreen, and the fragrance assailed the nostrils. Recently, the Lu family of Hutting County had overshadowed the other three families. It was like the osmanthus tree in front of a pair of women, growing alone in the forest. The head of the Lu family took the blame and resigned from the Imperial College. After drinking wine, he profited from the misfortune and entered the Ministry of Rites, becoming a second-rank official. After the carefree Sanren Tongshi sword immortal Lu Baijia left Retreat Garden, he went to the capital and immediately assumed the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War. He was only one step away from becoming a cabinet official. The two brothers echoed each other from a distance. The Jiangnan Lu family became famous overnight. They had to re-evaluate the family of the king of Bailiang. The family's reputation rose, but the most beautiful widow in Gangnam-do with a bad reputation was completely neglected. The scholar Lu Lighting was dragged to death on a horse. Who in Hutting County dared to get close to her? It was said that the widow caught a cold and her body, which was not weak, became thin. It was said that she lost a lot of weight. The men in Gangnam-do had complicated thoughts, but the women were united against a common enemy. Many of those who had suffered losses hurried to the temples and Taoist temples to burn incense and pray to the bodhisattvas. They wished that the fox spirit would die sooner. When the noble women who were familiar with her met, they would curse her in private to feel better. Now that the center of power of the Lu family had moved to the capital and the court, especially after the Tongshi sword immortal left Gangnam-do, it was inevitable that the Lu family of Hutting County would not be able to gain any advantage over trivial matters. The rumors that had been suppressed became more and more intense. The attacks and curses against the widow were reignited. The osmanthus seeds fell in front of the old osmanthus trees. The maid Xiao said angrily, "Miss, those shrews don't learn their lesson. They're starting to talk bad about you again. I really want to slap their mouths." Compared to before, she was indeed a much thinner woman. She reached out and tapped the tip of her maidservant's nose. She smiled charmingly and said, "You're still talking about others. Aren't you a little shrew yourself?" The young maidservant with delicate features giggled and said, "I heard from the heir that Miss used to love wearing red dresses and red garments. Why has Chao heir never seen it before?" The woman looked absent-minded and said softly, "You're still young, You won't understand even if I tell you. Dumb Qiao muttered. He's not small anymore. The woman bent down and picked up a handful of golden osmanthus seeds. Her hands were filled with the fragrance of osmanthus flowers. She raised her head and looked at the osmanthus leaves in silence. Chow, 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 chow. The pale-faced woman shook her head and said, let's wait a little longer. Chow chow of chow of chow of chow 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 kai of chow. The woman smiled. Tell me about it. The maid lowered her head and said, His Royal Highness once chatted with Chow Chow. He said that there was a coward on Mount Wudong who secretly liked you all these years. Chow Chow looked up at the sky and loosened her fingers. The osmanthus seeds fell one by one. She sighed. My brother lied to you. Chow Chow asked cautiously. Actually, you're also waiting in your heart, aren't you? Chow Chow asked. The woman turned her head and flicked her maid's smooth forehead. You shameless girl. Chow Chow's face turned red. She puffed up her cheeks and sulked. You're Suji who? Chow Chow heard a gloomy voice. Chow Chow raised her head in anger. She followed the voice and saw a young man squatting on the wall of Baogua Temple with a long saber on his back. Suji who reached out and pulled the maid behind him. Why are you looking for me? He asked calmly. The sabersman grinned. I'm Yuan Tingshan. I don't change my name. I have some grudges with His Royal Highness's brother. Besides, I'm doing things for others. If not, I wouldn't have come to Gangnam-do to make things difficult for a widow like you. Suji Hu's face darkened, but he did not panic. Yuan Tingshan, who had rushed all the way from Mount Hui to Gangnam-do, laughed. I'll kill all the guards of Lu Mansion outside. Those bald donkeys of Baogua Temple don't know what's good for them, so I'll kill them all and send them to meet Buddha in the Western Paradise. To be honest, only Sword Immortal Tangxi can fight with me in Gangnam-do. It's a pity that he went to the capital. Suji Hu, let alone Baogua Temple, even if you were in Lu Mansion I could still kill my way to you from the gate. Suji Hu sneered. If you want to kill me then kill me. Why are you nagging like a woman? Yuan Tingshan was not angry at all. He stared curiously at the beautiful widow and clicked his tongue. In the past when I killed people I didn't waste my breath with those who were about to die. But you're different. You have an interesting background. It's a pity that I can kill you with a saber. Suji Hu asked, What do you mean? Yuan Tingshan tilted his head and stretched out a bleeding arm. You're not afraid of death? If you're relying on that death warrior from Bailiang's maiden family who secretly protected you, then I might as well tell you that that brother is also dead. It's probably because he hasn't done any big business for many years and is a bit rusty. Otherwise, I'm afraid I would have to wait until later to enter Baogua Temple. Suji Hu, are you afraid of death now? Suji Hu smiled sadly and asked, How are you going to deal with the little girl behind you? Yuan Tingshan said bluntly, Naturally I'll kill her with a saber. I don't have the habit of being gentle with women. Suji Hu turned his head to look. The maid Air Chow smiled innocently. Miss, Air Chow is afraid of pain but she's not afraid of death. Suji Hu closed his eyes. Do it. Yuan Tingshan stood up and stood on top of the wall. His face was sinister as he slowly drew his saber. You dare. Words were accompanied by the clear cry of an ancient sword. There was a sword that came from Mount Wudong 1,000 li away. It landed in front of Suji Hu. A yellow crane arrived at Jiangnan's Lake Ting County. A young Daoist fell like a meteor and instantly arrived at Baogua Temple. Even someone as tenacious as Yuan Tingshan was dumbstruck when he jumped down the wall. A flying sword strangely hung in the air. A young Daoist appeared in front of him. This Daoist's actions were even more outrageous. He looked towards the southeast and said angrily, Zhao Huang Chao, do you believe that Hong Xixiang will sever your Zhao family's destiny with a single slash? The ancient sword disappeared in an instant. In front of Mount Longhu, a sword sheath fell from the 9 heavens to the earth. Another ancient sword flew over and coincidentally returned to its sheath. When the ancient sword returned to its sheath, the entire Mount Longhu shook. Then there was no trace of the Immortal. However, an Immortal sent a voice transmission. Zhao Huang Chao, do you believe that Hong Xixiang will sever your Zhao family's destiny with a single slash? 9 dragon pool destiny lotuses withered in an instant. In the ancestral hall of the Celestial Master Mansion, many ancestral tablets that had been worshipped for hundreds and thousands of years fell to the ground. A middle-aged Daoist from Mount Longhu was furious. He looked at the evil slaying platform. Hong Xixiang, whether you are the reincarnation of Lu Dongxian or Qi Xianzhu, aren't you afraid of the heavenly tribulation with such heaven-defying actions? The immortal's voice was like thunder from the 9 heavens. It landed on the evil slaying platform and came from afar. I have cultivated for 700 years. What can a mere heavenly tribulation do to me? In Baogua Temple, the young Daoist had yet to make a move. Yuan Tingshan was already bleeding from his 7 orifices. He gritted his teeth and broke through the wall with his back. He retreated again and again. The little maid Xiao Air, who was safe and sound, pulled on the sleeve of the woman in front of her. She asked blithely, "Miss, is he an immortal from the heavens?" Su Jihu's eyes were red. He turned his head away. He didn't look at the young martial granduncle who was angry for the first time in his life. Like a little girl, he said in a fit of pique, "What immortal? It's a stinky Daoist from Mount Wudong." The young Daoist who rode the crane to Jiangnan said that he didn't even care about the heavenly tribulation. However, at this moment he revealed an uneasiness that made the maid Xiao Air puzzled. A large yellow crane stopped in the courtyard. It blew down countless osmanthus seeds. Su Jihu, who had turned his head away, asked in a low voice, "What are you doing in Jiangnan?" Xiao Air only saw the Daoist's red face. He wanted to say something but stopped. She thought to herself, "Isn't this immortal Daoist too thin-skinned?" Su Jihu slowly turned his head and asked, "Who are you?" The young Daoist who had been entrusted with high hopes to shoulder the Tao of Heaven shyly said, "Hong Xixiang." Su Jihu repeated, "What are you doing here?" The young Daoist gathered his courage and said, "That year on Lotus Peak, you said you wanted to ride a crane." She turned her back to this coward. This Daoist who said he wanted to cut off the fate of the Zhou dynasty took a deep breath and smiled. "Su Jihu, I like you. Whether you believe it or not, I've already liked you for 700 years. So in this world, there's no one who has liked you for longer than me. In my next life I'll still like you." The maid Xiao Air blinked her watery eyes. Her little brain was a mess. She only saw the mist covering her mouth and crying and laughing. She was even more confused. It seemed that the mist was telling the truth when she said she was young and didn't know anything. The young Daoist stretched out his hand and said softly, "Where do you want to go? I'll accompany you." On this day the young sect leader of Wudong rode a crane to Jiangnan. He and Su Jihu rode the crane away from Jianghu. The immortal rode the crane down to Jiangnan. He had just entered Jianghu when he left Jianghu. Chapter 340. After His Royal Highness and company left the martial emperor city, the strange little worm calculated with his fingers and his face turned pale. He jumped off the horse and rolled on the road with tears and snot. He looked so pitiful, as if the father of the flower thief on the horse had been killed by a righteous person. Su Fengnian had heard from Tsing Yi about Dong Tai's flying sword killing people in the city and the conversation between the peach blossom sword god and little worm. He could vaguely guess the absurd background of this child. The little kid rolled on the ground until he was covered in dust. Finally, he stood in the middle of the road with his hands on his waist, facing the southwest direction. He wiped his snot and tears and cursed, "Damn it! Zhao Huangchao is such a bastard. Why are you fighting with our dragon Tiger Mountain? It's just that the Taoist master mansion didn't let the girl you liked go up the mountain to burn incense. The younger generation is fighting. What are you, an old man who has cultivated for several lifetimes, angry about? Don't think that I won't dare to speak just because you are ancestor Lu. Of course I'm trying to reason with you. Don't pick a fight with me. 9 lotuses of luck, 9 lotuses of luck. I only have so little money and it's all gone because of you. I've been diligent and thrifty all my life. Is it easy? Is it easy?" In the end, the little kid who kept calling himself poor began to sob. His little shoulders trembled. Those who heard him would cry and those who saw him would feel sad. Su Fengnian's face was filled with schadenfreude. He looked at the crowded Donghai from afar and took it as finding joy in misery. He rode his horse to Long Yushuan's side and asked with a smile, "Aren't you going to comfort your son?" Long Yushuan was so ashamed that he didn't know what to do. His face twitched and cold sweat covered his forehead. What son? The kid was called Old Immortal by the new sword god. It was a great advantage for him to call him his grandfather. The most important thing was whether the child was dead or not. Now that the child turned to Long Yushuan and called him Dad, Long Yushuan was also angry. He immediately replied, "Ancestor, don't play with the child." "Can I call you ancestor?" Little Worm rolled his eyes and said, "You are father just because I call you father? Then if I go to the capital and call the emperor grandson, he is really my grandson? Look at how useless you are." Long Yuxuan almost spat out a mouthful of blood. If it weren't for the fact that he had to hide his identity, he would have dismounted from his horse and hung this little bastard up to give him a good beating. Su Fengnian glanced at the quarrelsome couple and finally fixed his eyes on the little bug's young face. In the past, when he browsed through the Taoist classics, he had seen something like, over 100 years old but still looks like a baby, which was used to describe the miraculous nature of the Taoist immortals. The meeting of the three talents and the formation of the true nascent soul was exactly what the new god of sword Dong Tai had said. Noticing His Royal Highness's gloomy gaze, Little Worm patted his butt and put on the demeanor of an expert. He habitually stroked his beard, but after feeling nothing he realized that he was still a child after coming out of seclusion. How could he have a beard to pretend to be an expert? He smiled embarrassedly and didn't try to hide his identity. He swaggered to Long Yuxuan's side and climbed back onto his horse. He rode side by side with His Royal Highness and said, "I am Zhou Xuani from Mount Longhu." Although Su Fengnian was already mentally prepared, he was still shocked when he heard the little pervert's self-introduction. There were 4 Taoist masters in the ancestral court of Taoism. The 2 old Taoist masters, Zhao Shi and Zhao Shituan, were of the Hope generation. Not only were they high and mighty in the genealogy of the Taoist mansion, but they were also among the best in the world. After the Hope generation was Dan. So the brothers Zhao Danxia and Zhao Danping were of the Dan generation, followed by the Jing generation. Other than Zhao Shi and Zhao Shituan, there were also some old Taoist masters of the Hope generation who were in seclusion. However, they were either not the direct descendants of the Taoist mansion or had mediocre abilities. They were far less famous than the 2 old Taoist masters. However, no one outside the mountain had ever heard of the Xian generation, which was 2 generations higher than the Hope generation. 70 years old was already considered the oldest in the world. Su Fengnian estimated that the one in front of him was at least 270 years old. His Royal Highness steered his horse to a high slope, as if he was determined to wait for the old god of swords, Li Chungang. The Longhu spiritual master who claimed to be of the Xian generation frowned and said, "You're not leaving? Aren't you afraid that Li Chungang will lose to Wang Xianji again at such a close distance? When that time comes you'll have to bear the consequences. Dong Tai killed someone in Martial Emperor City and gave him the sword. He obviously put in a lot of effort." Su Fengnian looked at the sea surface and remained silent. The yellow pear sword box with the 12 flying swords was placed on his horse carriage. Su Fengnian did not dare to treat Dong Tai lightly. Dong Tai was famous for his strange words and actions. If this guy dug a hole, Su Fengnian would not be so stupid as to jump in without saying a word and bury himself alive. Back then, when the king of Jing and Zhao Heng gave this King Xinji's knife manual, Su Fengnian was not in a hurry to practice it. He still needed to wait until he returned to Beiliang and had his face appraised by the white fox. He needed to confirm that it was beneficial and harmless before he could practice it. What if he started practicing 1,000 miles in a day and then his tendons and meridians exploded, crippling his martial arts? Who would Su Fengnian complain to then? The battle on the surface of the East Sea was thunderous and the rain was heavy. The river and the sea were overturned and the curtain of swords was endless. The crowd of Martial Emperor City gathered by the sea was dumbfounded. They never thought that martial artists in the world could fight like this. Dozens of Jianghu people who wanted to watch the battle were smashed into pieces by the Gangqi and sword intent. The Martial Emperor City's city lord, Wang Xianji, had white hair and a white beard. He was tall and sturdy, standing barefoot on the raging waves with his hands behind his back. He let the 1,800 swords shoot out layer by layer, but they were broken and fell into the sea at a distance of 30 feet away. After 800 flying swords, the distance was only 20 feet. After another 600 swords, they were finally 10 feet away from Wang Xianji. The abundant sword qi and the strong gang qi clashed. Lightning intertwined and crackled, piercing people's eardrums. Another 300 swords pierced the black-robed and white-haired Wang Xianji's body, shattering inch by inch. The spectators thought that after the 1,800 swords failed to kill Wang Xianji, the old man would have exhausted all his skills. Unexpectedly, the old man slowly said, "Sword formed," and the broken swords that fell into the sea all floated to the surface. They gathered in the furnace and formed an unparalleled giant sword between the two men. When the sword was formed, the sky cracked and dazzling golden light slowly sprinkled down. The ordinary-looking old man laughed loudly and said, "Li Chungang, this sword can open the gate of heaven. Can it kill you, Wang Xianji?" Li Chungang opened the gate of heaven with one sword. He went straight to the point. This mountain was Kunlun. The people on the hillside were all in a daze. This was a real immortal on earth. When Xu Xiu, Yang Qingfeng, and even Bluebird couldn't help but look up at the peak battle of Donghai, they heard the screams of horses and the clanging sound of swords being drawn. When they looked back, they saw the horses that Long Yuxuan and Little Chong were riding had been cut in half at the waist. Long Yuxuan, who was excitedly watching the battle, was sitting in a pool of blood with a blank face. He didn't know how the horse could be cut in half at the waist like a chopstick being pinched by two fingers. What was even more strange was that the young founding master of Dragon Tiger Mountain was standing between the two halves of the horse's corpse with a gloomy face. After His Royal Highness, who had drawn his sword to kill people, was knocked back to Xiudong, he even pulled out the winter thunder. Zhao Xuansu, whose appearance didn't match her age and wisdom, smiled faintly and asked, "Su Fingyan, how did you know I was going to attack you?" Chapter 341. Su Fingyan smiled and said, "Old Heavenly Master Zhao, after knowing your identity, I was wondering why the old God of Swords, Li Chungang, and the new God of Swords, Dong Tai, were almost at the same level. Why did Li Chungang only feel that your background was strange, but he couldn't tell that you were at the level of an immortal? It's very simple. Back in the Martial Emperor City, you already had the intention to kill this young master and leaked the traces of your qi circulation. Originally, you wanted to take advantage of Li Chuangong's absence and kill this young master in front of the 6 Martial Emperor City's Martial Emperor slaves so that you could shift the blame to Wang Xianji. However, no matter how much you planned, you didn't expect that Deng Tea would also conceal his qi presence and enter the city, exposing your identity. If that was all, I have always respected experts and wouldn't have drawn my sword against you. Since old Immortal Zhao went down the mountain and acknowledged Long Yuxuan as his father, I treated him as an otherworldly expert who couldn't be judged by common sense. I felt that the Dragon Tiger Mountain was too boring and wanted to go down the mountain to play. May I ask, old Immortal Zhao, did you have the intention to kill me because of the 9 fate lotuses at the Withered Dragon Lake? Did you lose your patience?" Zhao Xuansu smiled faintly and said, "Everyone outside the mountain says that you're a good-for-nothing with a golden exterior. After seeing it with my own eyes, I really feel indignant for the young prince." Su Fingyan didn't hide anything and squinted his eyes. Old Immortal Zhao might not know, but before I came to the Dragon Tiger Mountain, I had interacted with Zhao Huangchao at the Kuanglu Mountain. Just now, old Immortal Zhao revealed his true feelings and spoke from the bottom of his heart. Others might not know the severity of it, but I was sweating profusely. To be honest, Zhao Xuansu smiled. Zhao Xuansu smiled and stretched out her arm. Her qi-dissolving mystery sucked her cheapskate father, who looked as if he was facing a great enemy, into her tender palm. With a bang, his entire body exploded like a snowball and his corpse fell to the ground. It was even more unsightly than the dismembered horse. The Daoist priest, who fit the description of a 1,000-year-old tortoise, only stared at His Royal Highness. He did not even look at Long Yuxuan, who died with his eyes wide open. He only sighed softly. Life is unpredictable. Fortune and misfortune depend on each other. Su Fingyan was similarly not shocked in the slightest. He didn't even turn his head to look at the flower thief who had just become a guest of Bailiang before suddenly dying in a foreign land. He didn't even bother to wipe away the blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. He looked down at the old ancestor of Mount Longhu and asked curiously, "I was only lucky enough to guess that old Immortal was going to make a move. As for why you wanted to kill me, I still don't quite understand. I hope old Immortal can enlighten me." Zhao Xuansu stretched out his hands and pressed down. Zhou Xian and Yang Qingfeng, along with their horses, were instantly pressed to the ground by a heavy weight. The 2 horses were crushed into meat paste. The 2 northern Liang retainers struggled to hold on, bleeding from their 7 orifices. Against this ancestor of Mount Longhu, they actually had no strength to fight back. The Daoist priest glanced at the surface of the eastern sea and chuckled. "It's okay if you want to delay time. I'm also waiting for the divine gate to open. Li Chungang, you're indeed the best swordsman in the 500 years after Ancestor Lu." Xu Xiu, who was on the verge of death, spat out blood. She lay on the ground and struggled. "Your Highness, save me." Su Fengnian turned a deaf ear to her and laughed. "Why? Old Immortal has such a mysterious supernatural power. Are you still afraid of the illusory fate that entangles you and prevents you from ascending?" The Daoist priest sighed. "How can I not be afraid? Since things have come to this, I'll make it clear to you. I, Zhao Xuansu, am only one step away from ascending to immortality. It was so before 60 years, but it's still so after 60 years. Just like how I killed Long Yuxuan just now, fortune and misfortune are intertwined. The Taoist priest's residence, Zhao family, shares the same surname as the Son of Heaven, Zhao family. 500 years of karma entangled with each other, just like how the black tortoise totem entangled with a snake. Their fates have long been mixed up. When I entered the martial emperor city and met Dong Tai, my killing intent had faded. When your fate was strong and you weren't destined to die, I was happy to be a coward and hide in Mount Longhu. Unfortunately, when I got here, Li Chungang opened the divine gate with his sword. Even if I killed you, I could take the opportunity to ascend. Look, that's the divine gate. I once made a bet with Xiao Huangchao that whoever ascended first would lose a seal. Once I ascended today, my fate would be retribution. If that old bastard dares to take the seal, he would have to find Zhao Huangchao. As for you, Su Fengnian, you died in front of Wang Xianji. Zhao family's imperial court borrowed Su Zhao's butcher's knife to cut off the rotten meat of martial emperor city. Evil people will be dealt with by evil people. It's my compensation to my century-old friend Zhao Huangchao. Su Fengnian praised. "Old Immortal, you have a good plan." Zhao Xuansu laughed. "I've lived for a long time. My Dao is ordinary, but I'm thick-skinned." The Taoist priest laughed. "I advise you not to expect the two land immortals to notice the abnormality here. I still have the ability to do so." An instant spear curved like a crescent moon and swept down from the sky. Zhao Xuansu did not move and allowed the instant spear to hit the young body. However, the next scene was Blue Bird vomiting blood and flying backward. The Taoist priest said regretfully, "Little girl, it's a pity for your body." Then he looked at His Royal Highness and seemed to be mocking. "You can still keep your composure?" Blue Bird stood up shakily, but the instant spear did not leave her hand. Su Fengnian glanced at Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng, who were struggling. He waved his hand to stop Blue Bird, who was trying to fight to the death with the Taoist priest, and asked, "Everyone here has to die?" Zhao Xuansu nodded. Su Fengnian chuckled and said, "Then let me go first?" Zhao Xuansu did not say any nonsense. He instantly shrank the ground and swept in front of Su Fengnian. He did not give him any chance to draw his knife and block. His move was a killer move. Just as he was about to touch His Royal Highness, a hand blade strangely pierced towards him. Even Zhao Xuansu, who had a high realm, was repelled by this mysterious move. He looked down and saw a scarlet blood groove on his neck. He looked up and saw a girl with an old-fashioned smile. Zhao Xuansu frowned. He saw that the sword in the distance had opened the gate of heaven and opened the line between the sea and the sky. It was clearly the best time. He twisted his neck and his body made continuous cracking sounds. It was like a string of soybeans exploding. Zhao Xuansu sneered, "Not bad, not bad. His Royal Highness has some skills. He actually forced me to summon my real body." The Taoist priest's bones, flesh, and blood began to grow like an old tree in spring. Su Fengnian said calmly, "So that's what they say. You're really not a master. Not to mention the old god of swords Li Chungang, even the new god of swords Dong Tai is far from you." Zhao Xuansu was furious. He looked up to the sky and laughed. "Nephew, your flattery is just so." A unique mellow voice came from the bottom of the hill. "I gave you the sword first and repaid half of your kindness. After killing you, I repaid the other half. I saved you twice. From today onwards, Dong Tai and your mother Wuxia no longer owe each other. You are not a master if you don't show off." How is he not a master? He obviously lived his whole life as a dog. Dong Tai is here to kill the dog. Since Senior Li's sword was formed in the Eastern Sea, Dong Tai will not make a fool of himself. Sword rise. Zhao Xuansu showed a panicked expression for the first time. He said angrily, "Dong Tai, how did you know this place changed?" Dong Tai raised the sword. How would the world know it reached the peak? Dong Tai, who was standing 10 feet away, spread out his hands and smiled. "Amei Zhu Ke Huang Tong. Tai Tai Jin Lu. Tai Ah." 6 small swords broke out of the box. They were nailed to the top of Zhao Xuansu's head, temples, and 3 dantians. The Taoist said that the Immortal could level the earth and shatter the mountains and rivers. Why don't you let me see it? His body collapsed. Zhao Xuansu forced his primordial spirit to leave his body. Like a rainbow, he flew towards the heavenly gate. Dong Tai took a step forward. He said calmly, "You want to become an immortal? You have to ask Dong Tai's sword first. Come back." The 6 flying swords were clearly nailed to Zhao Xuansu's body. However, the primordial spirit of the Taoist reflected the outline of the 6 swords. The primordial spirit was pulled back into the body. Su Fengyan did not say anything. He cut the primordial spirit in half and laughed, "I will let you become an immortal." Chapter 342. Seeing that the body of the elder ancestor of Dragon Tiger Mountain, which had returned to its original state, was split open by Su Fengyan's saber, Zhou Xian, who was lying on the ground, had a gleeful and ferocious look in his eyes. In the past, when he was living under someone else's roof in the northern Liang mansion, he had done a lot of dirty business involving human lives. There were also several dangerous situations where his life was hanging by a thread, but it had never been as futile as today. Facing Zhao Xuansu, who had been showing the appearance of a child all the way to Martial Emperor City, he could not even touch half an inch of his sleeve before he was suffocated by Zhao Xuansu's majestic qi, bleeding from his 7 orifices. Seeing His Royal Highness succeed in one strike with the help of Dong Tai's divine sword skill, she felt so comfortable that she could not wait to marry this young crown prince on the spot. She was well aware that if Su Fengyan had not spoken, her and Yang Qingfeng's qi would have exploded together with their flesh and blood. Xu Xiu could not be as open-minded as Lu Qiantang, who had died in the common reed marsh. She had just escaped from the gloomy prison in Bailiang and even had the chance to replace Pei Nanwei as the fake princess of Jingyan Palace. How could she be willing to die here? Xu Xiu silently recited the Heart Sutras and smoothed her qi. Her whole body was in so much pain that it penetrated her heart. Inevitably, her beautiful and charming face was distorted. However, as soon as one wave subsided, another wave arose. Before Xu Xiu could criticize Zhao Xuansu's unsightly death, she saw the 6 flying swords of the Peach Blossom Sword deity buzzing like cicadas. The out-of-body primordial spirit, which had failed to reach the gate of heaven, was still condensed and did not disperse after losing its physical body. Instead, it seemed to have been freed from its shackles and was floating in the air. Dressed in a yellow and purple Taoist robe with wide sleeves, it looked like a celestial being with a celestial demeanor. Xu Xiu looked up in a daze at the rootless primordial spirit that seemed to be free and unfettered in heaven and earth. An overwhelming sense of fear surged over her. Xu Xiu turned her head with difficulty and looked at Dong Tai standing in the distance. The truth of the 12 flying swords that came out of the box in 2 batches had already been revealed. Black armor, childhood sweetheart, morning dew, spring water, peach blossom, moth eyebrows, vermilion bird, huang tong wei yu and taiya. Clearly, in Xu Xiu's opinion, the one who could fight against the great Jinren of Longhu Mountain, Zhao Xuansu, was not the overly young His Royal Highness. It could only be this renowned new peach blossom sword god. After Xu Xiu caught her breath, she immediately struggled to get up. Without caring about her bearing, she stuck out her perky buttocks, bent over and staggered backwards. Yang Qingfeng, on the other hand, was not afraid of death. She sat cross-legged where she was and quietly adjusted her breathing. Su Fengyan held his blade and slowly retreated. He squinted his eyes and looked at Zhao Xuansu, who was similar to the middle-aged Taoist at the peak of Kuanglu Mountain. He sneered, "A centipede dies but does not fall down. Each one of the old Taoists is more greedy than the other." Zhao Xuansu, who was not allowed to enter the heavenly gate, turned around and looked at the golden light spilling over the surface of the sea. His expression was complicated. The 6 short swords were still inserted in the 6 major acupoints. They were like gangrene attached to the bones. When the flying swords entered the primordial spirit, a sizzling sound was heard as if hot water was poured over ice and snow. However, Zhao Xuansu did not feel it at all. The flying swords that Dong Tai carried with him were naturally not ordinary weapons. Otherwise, they would not be able to hurt the Yuanying of a Jinren who was on an astral journey. Although the swords were small, the heroic spirit contained in the swords was bottomless. The people of the world thought that slaying demons and demons was a trick that Taoism deliberately mystified. In fact, this was not the case. Therefore, when the martial artists of Jianghu reached the state of perfection, It was also within the law and principle that they used celestial beings to test their swords. Dong Tai always had an indifferent and gentle appearance. He did not have the consciousness of confronting a land immortal at all. He smiled and asked, Dong Tai has never been to Mount Longhu before. I don't know if these 6 swords are too light or too heavy a gift for you. I feel very uneasy. Although they were in a dangerous situation, Su Fengyan could not help but laugh. This Dong Tai was indeed a strange and wonderful person. First he called Zhao Xuansu an old dog. Now he was pretending to be polite. However, there was no respect in his words. It was really a slap in the face. Su Fengyan then sighed with emotion. If Dong Tai did not have this sword manipulation mystery, how could he be so calm? Weren't people like Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng suppressed by Zhao Xuansu before they could even say a word? Not to mention Long Yushuan, whose life was full of misfortunes. After being a father for a few days, he was turned into powder by his son, who turned against him. This Mount Longhu was indeed very different from Mount Wudong. The old chief, Wang Zhongluo, did not have the slightest arrogance of a Taoist leader. The few times they met, he was kind and amiable. It was not only because he was the heir of Bailiang. In such a large Taoist ancestral court, only Zhao Shituan could be considered a good person. No wonder this sloppy old Taoist was depressed. It was because prime ministers like Zhao Danping had stolen the high position and were like the sun in the sky. Thinking of this, Su Fengyan glanced at the assassin in front of him. The young lady chuckled. For the sake of 1,000 taels of gold, was this young lady of mysterious origins really willing to be so greedy that she wouldn't come out? She did not even care about her own life. First it was the 11th in the world, Wang Mingyin. Now it was the great spiritual master, Zhao Xuansu. What was she planning? Was she going to kill or save? Jia Jia Jia? The 3 characters of the name were all homophonic. Su Fengyan had once sent a secret letter to Su Xiao, asking if she had planted a death warrior by his side. This was a major matter that involved Su Fengyan's life and death. Su Xiao had personally written a letter stating that this girl was not the #1 death warrior in the palace. As a result, Su Fengyan was even more confused. What was in this girl's little head? Who would believe that she was purely a little money grubber? As for the fact that he did not disperse Zhao Xuansu's spirit with one strike, Su Fengyan was definitely disappointed. However, he was not surprised. The methods of celestials were originally mysterious and unpredictable. The 2 on the surface of the East Sea had moved mountains and drained seas to open the gate of heaven. Each of them had displayed their magical powers. How shocking! Although Zhao Xuansu was definitely inferior to Wang Xianji and Li Chungang in terms of martial arts, it would be too degrading to say that she was killed by His Royal Highness with one strike. After all, he was an old Taoist who had cultivated for a few lifetimes on Mount Longhu. Zhao Xuansu knew the Jianghu without going out and knew the world without going down the mountain. Untainted by the mortal world, he gently flicked his sleeves and flicked the 2 flying swords named Mothmei and Vermilion Bird out of the 2 major acupoints. The flying swords were not broken. After being forced out, they flew around the old Taoist. Zhao Xuansu ignored them and laughed softly. I heard that Dong Tai's swordsmanship is 2 realms higher than his peers. It's close to Lu Zu's sword art. Today I was fortunate enough to experience it personally. However, it's impolite not to reciprocate. I also have some insignificant skills that I would like to learn from Sword God Deng. Dong Tai asked, Old Taoist Master, since you have no hope of becoming an immortal in this life and your body has been destroyed, why don't you go with the flow and find a good family to reincarnate while your vital spirit is still gathered? As he spoke, Zhao Xuansu flicked his sleeves again and forced the golden strands of the sword out of his acupoint. He stroked his beard and said, When I was young, I swore that I would not attain the great way and seek a place in the heavenly court. If I die, so be it. I don't care about the 9 kinds of corpses of Taoism. Dong Tai was also in a leisurely mood. He did not beat a drowning dog like the common people. Instead he asked calmly, Taoism's prophecy is said to be able to predict good and bad luck. It can predict the wind and rain of the next 500 years. Can't it predict one's own life? Su Fengyan watched as the old Taoist flicked his sleeves for the 3rd time and sent the 2 flying swords into the air. Only the small Taiya sword was left. Zhao Xuansu shook his head and said in a low voice, The heavenly way is like a carriage. It moves as fast as lightning. There are moths circling leisurely in it. Why doesn't this moth hit the wall of the carriage? Dong Tai said with a face full of emotions, How can one be free in the heavenly way? If one can't step out of Kunlun, one can't live for more than 100 years. Chapter 343. Su Fengyan was baffled and did not feel enlightened. He only knew that the two masters were ready to attack. To be precise, Dong Tai was confident to the point of conceit, allowing Zhao Xuansu to escape from the Six Swords prohibition. In the carriage, Murong Tonghuang lifted the curtain to watch the battle. Murong Wuzhu was timid and did not dare to look. She shrank in the corner and shivered. Suddenly she widened her eyes. She saw the yellow pearwood box rise slowly and shake violently. The sword box opened and the 6 exquisite swords flew out. Dong Tai waited until the small swords that shared the same fate as him flew into the air. He said softly, "I don't think about the way of heaven, but ever since I started practicing, I have never doubted the sword in my hand." Everyone only saw Dong Tai, who was unparalleled in the art of killing, smiling as he stretched out his finger and flicked it. 12 small swords lined up in a straight line in front of him, as if they were going to draw a gap between heaven and earth. The heaven and earth changed color and its momentum was not inferior to the surface of the East Sea. 60 moments in a flick of the finger and 900 deaths in an instant. This was the essence of the finger mystery. Therefore Wang Xianji once said that in the world, only the white-robed monk Li Dongxin had obtained the essence of the Vajra realm. Chao Chongqing took 8 portions of the celestial phenomenon spirit, and Dong Tai won the first finger mystery. There were 4 realms in the first stage, but it did not mean that the level of martial arts attainment was higher or lower. Especially for the saints of the 3 sects who had the advantage of time, place and people. Even if they entered the Earth Immortal realm, they might not be a match for the loose immortals outside the 3 sects in a battle of life and death. Moreover, the 3 sects had always valued the way of heaven and despised martial arts. Even the supernatural power of Lu Zu's flying sword was regarded as a strange skill that was incompatible with the way of heaven. It could be seen that the saints of the 3 sects did not value martial arts. Dong Tai smiled and said, "The sword formation is called the weapon release. I originally prepared it for Wang Xianji. It is a pity that I used it on you." Zhao Xuansu squinted and said, "What a great thunder pool. I dare to cross it and see if Sword God Deng can use the weapon release." The ancestor of the Dragon Tiger Mountain crossed it. The sword formation was like a rainbow. The out-of-body primordial spirit was instantly shredded into nothingness. In a flash, Dong Tai angrily said, "Old dog Zhao, how dare you be so opportunistic?" Dong Tai came behind His Royal Highness, grabbed him by the collar and was about to throw Su Fengyan back. However, the new god of swords was alert and quick enough, but he still could not resist a torrent of purple gas pouring down in front of Su Fengyan. He could vaguely hear Zhou Xian's last words on the eve of his death. "Since I can't cut off the fate, I'll use a trick and steal a heavenly secret. I'll pass the calamity of Mount Longhu on to you." Purple chi from the east. Although the sword formation had destroyed most of it, about 20 to 30% of it still flowed into Su Fengyan's body. It was the first time that Dong Tai showed such an angry expression. The world was silent as he shouted, "Zhao Xuansu, I want your mansion of Taoist master to have no descendants." The Sanqing purple chi was vast and mighty, lingering around Su Fengyan's body. The calamity was imminent. Dong Tai was extremely annoyed. He was familiar with many unorthodox methods of Taoism, and this Zhao Xuansu obviously wanted to use his life to kill Su Fengyan and destroy his fate. Although Dong Tai thought that he rarely met a worthy opponent, karma and fate were the most unpredictable things in this world. His karma with Su Fengyan was very shallow. In fact, after the death of his consort Wu Su, all that was left was a verbal promise from a young swordsman. He had already paid it back by using his sword twice inside and outside the Eastern Sea Martial Emperor city. In a flash, the purple gas and Su Fengyan were very harmonious. No matter how powerful Dong Tai was, he could not cut off the chi dynamic. Even if he took a step back, he was willing to bear this calamity, but he was powerless to absorb the fate. This was also the reason why Dong Tai hated Zhao Xuansu the most. As a Taoist spiritual master, he was actually so vicious. The girl turned around and stared blankly at Su Fengyan, whose red date between his eyebrows had turned from purple to black. She smiled, but she was not gloating. Instead, she looked a little sad. Perhaps even Huang Sanjia would be shocked if he saw this unfamiliar emotion. She tiptoed and reached out to touch His Royal Highness's black glabella. Even Dong Tai was stunned, but he did not stop her in the end. Bailiang was cold and bitter. That year it was snowing. A little girl knelt by the roadside and sold her body to bury her mother. She was born at the bottom of the market. Her father was addicted to gambling. They used to be a small family, but after a few years he lost all his fortune. After his daughter was born, he swore to his wife that he would never gamble again. He even chopped off one of his fingers, but he still could not stop his addiction to gambling. For as long as the child could remember, she saw her father threaten to sell her and threaten her mother to become a prostitute. He drank and scolded the mother and daughter without restraint. That was his greatest achievement. As the child grew up in poverty, her mother's face gradually withered and she earned less money. The girl could never forget those vulgar men who walked out of the leaky thatched house with their waistbands and threw a dozen copper coins to her father. That man bent over to receive the money with a flattering smile. Later, when her mother knew that the man was determined to sell her daughter, she, who was terminally ill, changed into the last set of plain clothes she had. She sent her daughter away to pick some wild vegetables and cooked a pot of rice porridge with arsenic. When the girl returned home, the man who had not called her father since he was sensible was already cold. The small pot of porridge only had 6 bowls. He only cared about himself and drank 5 bowls in one breath. Naturally, he died quickly. The woman who only drank 1 bowl of porridge hugged her daughter before she died. She bled and cried, unable to speak. The little girl, whose fingers were bleeding from frostbite, washed her mother's face and put her on the straw mat. She didn't look at the man and went to Liangzhou City, kneeling beside the straw mat. This scene was not strange in the winter of Baoyang, so she didn't need to write anything on the charcoal, nor did she need to cry and complain. But who would be willing to do such an unlucky thing that would cost a lot of money for a filthy little girl in thin clothes? The road was full of beautiful women in mink fur. No one would take a second look at the little girl who might not be able to survive the harsh winter. A few ruffians who had taken money from her family passed by and kicked away the straw mat, revealing the body of the little girl's mother. She was lying on her mother's body. They said that her mother was a dirty woman and that they should just throw her body out in the wild. She cried and said that her mother was not dirty at all, so they stepped on the body. The little girl bit one of the ruffian's legs, but she was pulled up by the hair and punched in the stomach. He asked her if she was dirty or not. Every time she said no, every time she shook her head, she was punched. How old was she at that time? How many punches could she take? But the passers-by were indifferent and no one cared about this. Many people were bored and watched with great interest. Later, a luxurious carriage passed by. Probably because he heard the noise, a young man in a luxurious white coat got off the carriage and came to her side. Next to him stood a beautiful woman who covered her nose with her eyes full of disgust. He asked her who was prettier, her mother or the woman next to her. The little girl, whose mouth was bleeding, gave an answer that made the onlookers burst into laughter. The seductive woman who accompanied the young man was embarrassed, and her eyes were full of anger and coldness. The young man, whose absurd reputation had spread all over Baoyang, didn't show any expression. He took a pearl hairpin from the head of the woman next to him. There was a huge pearl hanging at the end of the hairpin. The little girl didn't know that a pearl was worth 1,000 gold. She only saw the man squat down and put the hairpin on her mother's head, asking her if it was pretty. The little girl cried and said yes. He patted her head and chuckled but didn't say anything. He returned to the carriage and left. After that, someone immediately buried her mother. That winter day, the little girl knelt at the grave and met Huang Longshi. In these years, other than killing people, her only hobby was collecting hairpins. This year, outside Xianxia City, she killed that so-called 11th in the world. Whoever wanted that young man to die, she wanted him dead. She didn't care if he was a first-rank master or an immortal on earth. To her, this was the only reason. Chapter 344. Killing a man in 10 steps, leaving no trace for 1,000 miles. When the deed is done, I leave with a flick of my sleeve, hiding my identity and name. The essence of this popular paladin poem was the word kill. If it was changed to save, it would obviously be neither fish nor fowl. At this moment, His Royal Highness, who was sitting sickly in the carriage, was in a very strange mood. His aunt Jiajia, who kept a big cat as a pet, originally thought that even if it was not because of national enmity, she was a cold-blooded and ruthless first-class assassin who would not lend a helping hand. Zhao Xuansu's 3 Pure Tribulations. A few days ago, at the top of the Donghai slope, Su Fengyan's body was like an alchemy furnace, boiling abnormally. Unlike the external elixir that used gold, stone, and medicinal herbs as bait, the inner elixir melted one's essence, qi, and spirit. The danger within was not inferior to Taoist Zhao's killing move. Zhao Xuansu's purple qi from the east and Su Fingyan's big yellow courtyard were like weapons of war. Su Fingyan fell into a coma and was on the verge of death. When he woke up, he found out from Bluebird that it was Jia Jiejia who saved his life and caused the purple qi to flow into her body. Then she left without leaving a word. The Peach Blossom Sword deity asked Bluebird to leave a message for his distant nephew, saying that he had removed the prohibition of the 12 swords and needed a new master to feed him with blood. The shortest was 3 years, the longest was 10 years. As long as he had enough qi and learned a superior sword-controlling technique, he would be able to control the 12 swords. Back then he owed the Su family or Wu Su a life-saving debt. Even if he did not owe them anything, he would not meet them in the future. Old Man Li opened the curtain and bent over to enter the carriage. He sat down lazily against the wall. Su Fingyan glanced at him. How the Battle of Donghai ended. He only heard that it was a draw, but no one could see any clues. Wang Xianji opened the sea to send the old sword deity off, giving him enough face. Obviously, old monster Wang, who had stood at the peak of martial arts for 60 years, had never forgotten the kindness of half a wooden bull. This made Su Fingyan have a good impression of the martial emperor Castellan. The old god of swords saw a yellow pearwood box on the cotton blanket with a picture of 100 birds paying homage to the phoenix. He opened the sword box without a trace of politeness. Despite the dense sword aura, the old man with the sheepskin fur coat said, "Sissy embroidery needle. Is this junior surname Deng a woman?" Su Fingyan, whose injuries had spread from the inside out, was pale. His knees were covered with a small satin blanket made by Shishu. In addition, there was a new charcoal stove in the carriage. It was not winter yet, which showed how weak His Royal Highness was. He smiled bitterly and said, "Fortunately, Dong Tai was not present. Otherwise you would have to fight." Li Chungang reached out to take off his boots and buckled his feet. He blew his beard and glared. "What? This old man can't beat Wang Xianji, but he can't beat Dong Tai?" Su Fingyan raised his eyebrows and asked carefully, "You lost at Donghai?" Li Chungang pursed his lips and said straightforwardly, "This old man has lost, so what's there to hide? Wang Xianji's realm has fallen in recent years, but his cultivation has been steadily rising. His foundation is solid and his comprehension is good. It's not strange that he can't beat Wang Xianji. However, in that fight Wang Xianji had used 90% of his strength. If he had fought with all his strength, perhaps only Ancestor Lu from 500 years ago would have been able to suppress this ignorant man. This old man is still a bit lacking. It's a pity that you didn't see the scene of him raising the water of Donghai. It's very frightening." Ignoring the shock in His Royal Highness' heart, the old god of swords looked at the sword box again. This time he didn't speak harshly. He sighed softly and said, "These 12 pocket-sized flying swords have their seals removed. They're almost considered half-dead objects. It's not easy for them to have such sword intent. In terms of sword nurturing and flying swords, Dong Tai is indeed the #1 in the world. He's worthy of being the sword genius who made the Wu family's sword tomb lose face. However, calling him a childhood sweetheart is really making this old man's teeth sour. It's a far cry from wooden horse ox. The battle between sword techniques and Taoist techniques seems like water and fire, but when techniques reach the peak they're no different from Taoism. Dong Tai is a smart person. He's like Wang Xianji who uses strength to prove Taoism. Only this kind of Jiang who is interesting." Su Fingyan's expression was strange. The old man wearing the sheepskin coat felt comfortable and reached out to close the sword box again. Su Fingyan felt a headache coming on. Fortunately, the person in front of him was Li Chungang. Otherwise, he could treat the sword box as a gift from Dong Tai in such a way. If it were an ordinary hero of Jianghu, he wouldn't be able to worship this small box. Li Chungang probably saw His Royal Highness's gaze and said unhappily, "Have you ever heard that the cold people need warmth? Don't take people's clothes and make them into lichens?" No matter how ignorant and incompetent Su Fingyan was, the poem was easy to understand and he could clearly hear the sarcasm in it. He lowered his head and saw the expensive blanket, which was worth an inch of gold. He was stunned and mocked himself, "Senior, you worry about the country and the people. You're indeed a great master." Chapter 345. The old man wearing the sheepskin fur coat was indifferent to this kid's flattery. He picked his earwax and clicked his tongue. I heard that Zhou Xuansu didn't hesitate to risk his old life to frame you for the calamity of Mount Longhu. It's fine if the young assassin who killed Wang Mingyin didn't take advantage of the situation, but she even helped you? King of Jing'an and Zhao Heng's 1,000 taels of gold were all wasted? This old man couldn't understand this matter no matter how much he thought about it. To say that you're unlucky is indeed extremely unlucky. You've provoked Zhao Xuansu, a celestial master who hasn't appeared in 100 years. But to say that you're lucky is also not wrong. You were clearly facing a great calamity, but you were still able to turn the tables. By accident, the 3 pure purple clouds opened your acupuncture points. How many floors are you in the Great Yellow Hall? When you recover from your injuries, won't you be able to touch the threshold of the Vajra physique? It's true that riches come from danger. This old man Zhao Xuansu is really a good-for-nothing. He doesn't have the ability to challenge Su Xiao and Baoyang's 300,000-strong cavalry. He only knows how to find trouble with you, a junior. It's said that a small temple is big, but in this old man's opinion Mount Longhu is full of bastards. He went for wool and came home shorn. Now that he's provoked Dong Tai, the celestial master's residence won't be peaceful. Su Fengyan covered his stinging chest, gritted his teeth and sneered. This stinky old Taoist was stopped by Dong Tai. He couldn't kill me, so he took advantage of the opportunity when you opened the gate of heaven and wanted to leave his body and ascend. In the end, he was still intercepted by Dong Tai's flying sword. I had no choice but to burn both jade and common stone. Originally, I didn't haggle with Mount Longhu last time because Xiao Shituan accepted Huang Manor as his disciple. Sure enough, kind people are bullied. No matter how Dong Tai acts, the next time I climb Mount Longhu, I'll definitely let this group of noble people suffer. Li Chungang sneered and said, with your little cultivation? Do you really think you're like Dong Tai or Chao Chongqing? Su Fengyan smiled calmly and said, I'm young. In addition, with the guidance of the old senior, I'll be able to achieve twice the results with half the effort. There will be a day when I can take my revenge and vent my anger. Li Chungang stretched out a finger and tapped the sword box. He chanted the word rise, and the box slid open. The 12 flying swords floated in the air and lined up in a line. It was exactly the same as Dong Tai's formation. He ignored Su Fengyan's surprise and said, the path of sword intent has reached the peak. The turbulent river flows to the East Sea and the rolling thunder strikes the heavenly court. It seems to be too overbearing and without any rules. But in the end it is still going along the path and there are rules to follow. Formula Dao and Formula Dao were both indispensable. For example, if a person traveled a long distance, technique was the strength of the feet and Dao was the path. If one only had the strength of the feet, going astray was just drawing a circle around the ground and not going far. If one only knew the direction but did not walk, it was nothing more than looking at plums to quench one's thirst. Dong Tai is still too stingy. He only gave you the 12 flying swords but did not leave behind the sword riding method. Instead of giving a man a fish, teaching a man to fish is better than teaching a man to fish. This old man showed the 2-sleeved green snake no less than 100 times. If you really memorized it, it would be a superior sword riding method. One day you would be able to break through the bottleneck and use the big yellow court in your body to kill people with flying swords. The ancients said that after reading 10,000 books, one would be able to write like a god. This was also the reason why this old man wanted little Jiang to practice calligraphy and not swordsmanship. How is calligraphy not swordsmanship? It's not that this old man is boasting, but the 2-sleeved green snake is the pinnacle of swordsmanship in the Jianghu for 100 years. It's equivalent to spreading the 10,000 books on your desk. As for how much you can understand, it depends on your luck. This old man can't teach you swordsmanship like a child walking. Firstly, it's too degrading. Secondly, it's just pulling up seedlings to help them grow. It's not beneficial at all. The 12 flying swords trembled at a speed almost invisible to the naked eye. Descend. The flying swords slowly descended and lay quietly in the sword case. In the face of the old god of swords Li Chunggang's unprecedented sigh, Su Fengyan softly called him old senior, and did not say anything else. The one-armed Li Chungang lifted the curtain and looked at the scenery outside the window. He smiled and said, as you guessed, after this old man's battle with Wang Xianji, he has no regrets about swordsmanship or life. This old man has no children. He's an old man with no one to rely on. He has no attachments. What he said today is true even if he's about to die. In this life he was once young and frivolous. He used his sword to cut down injustice. But the world is so big. How can this old man settle it with his sword alone? I remember that a long time ago, there was a female poet who praised this old man for destroying the 5 great mountains with his sword. This old man disdained to take responsibility for it. But now that I think about it carefully, there's some truth to it. For a moment, Su Fengyan had mixed feelings and was speechless. Logically speaking, Li Chungang should have been the undisputed champion of swordsmanship after returning to the realm of swordsmanship and fighting with Wang Xianji. At the very least he could be on par with Dong Tai. He was one of the top 3 martial arts grandmasters in the world. It was time for him to rise up and make the new Jianghu look at him in a new light. But now the old man wearing the sheepskin coat was calm and relaxed. He had the intention to completely withdraw from the Jianghu. It was not because he was disheartened but because he had no attachments and no more requests. He truly had the strength of an immortal. Li Chungang put down the curtain and said softly, "After I send you back to Baoyang, I'll go see Miss Zhang one last time and teach her everything I've learned. Do you have anything you want this old man to tell you?" Su Fengyan shook his head. Li Chungang was not a narrow-minded person who was obsessed with love, so he did not continue on this topic. Suddenly he said to himself with a smile, "I wonder who will be able to subdue the old monster Wang Xianji in the future." Su Fengyan asked tentatively, "How's the face of White Fox who came out of the tower after reaching the top? How's the Huang man, who entered the finger mystery?" The old man wearing the sheepskin coat thought for a moment and said, "That White Fox's face is still far from being as good as the one who came out of the tower. But if he is given some opportunities and fights with a few of the top 10 masters for 10 or 20 years, then he can go to the martial emperor city and have a wonderful fight. As for your brother, hey, he's the second Wang Xianji. There's no need for him to fight." Su Fengyan was in a good mood. Su Fengyan lifted the curtain and saw the beautiful scenery outside. There was a green mountain in front of them with green bamboos as far as the eye could see. He asked Bluebird to stop and got off the carriage to take a walk, feeling relaxed and happy. This was the first time Pei Nanwei and the Murong siblings had seen His Royal Highness recently. In addition, the scenery in the distance was very beautiful, so they all got off the carriage to enjoy the scenery. Xu Xiu looked at the young crown prince who was seriously injured and somewhat dispirited. She did not know why, but after the white horse left Liangzhou, it had been nurturing something. Until outside the martial emperor city, the man who had experienced the great calamity finally transformed. Xu Xiu stared at the back of the figure in a daze. For a moment she was a little dazed. Chapter 346. As they ascended the mountain, green bamboo lined the path and a cool breeze blew. Qing Yao draped a fox fur coat over Su Fengyan, which was out of season. Su Fengyan was tall and slender and his skin was excellent. As a result, it added a lot of otherworldly aura to this young master, making him look like a wild fox. Princess Jing and Pei Nanwei and the Murong siblings followed closely behind. The old god of swords Li Chungang stayed at the foot of the mountain to guard the carriage, so he did not follow them. This allowed Xu Xiu to leave her post to guard the carriage for once. While admiring the sea of bamboo, she quietly observed the back of that figure from a close distance. When Pei Nanwei saw a small lake as clear as a mirror halfway up the mountain, she was quite amazed. Especially when she saw that there was a house built in the middle of the lake. On the lakeside, there was a delicate bamboo raft made of nanju. The green bamboos reflected the scenery and the sound of the bamboo rustling in the wind. It was like a fairyland. Su Fengyan did not intend to disturb the owner of the bamboo house in the middle of the lake. He walked straight to the beautiful and graceful bamboo by the lakeside. With a gentle tap of his toes, the bamboo would rather break than bend. It had always been compared by scholars to have a strong moral integrity. At this moment, under Su Fengyan's feet, the bamboo bent meekly and extended toward the lake in a subtle arc. When Su Fengyan stopped, the bamboo was still more than 2 zhang above the lake. Su Fengyan suddenly thought of Wang Chushue's words. Was it the sound of the people's suffering last night when the rain knocked on the bamboo? He wondered if this little girl who had just experienced her first awakening of love was doing well recently. He stood on the bamboo and looked into the distance. Smoke rose from the bamboo house in the center of the lake. After he left the martial emperor city and woke up, he received a secret letter from Chu Lushan. When Su Fengyan heard that the bull-riding fellow had finally left the mountain, He had already amazed the world with a single brilliant feat. He rode a crane to Jiangnan and rescued eldest sister from Yuan Tingshan's clutches. Not to mention he even rode ancestor Lu's sword and flew to Mount Longhu. He was thousands of li away from Zhao Huangchao and left behind a few words. 9 of the Dragon Pond's lotus of fortune had withered, which shook the world. He could not be more immortal. Su Fengyan also did not know what relationship this fellow had with ancestor Lu Qishuanzhen. To His Highness the Crown Prince, as long as this coward was wholeheartedly devoted to eldest sister and was liked by eldest sister. So what if Yu Hongxixiang were just a nameless road sweeper on Mount Wudong? The Su family dominated Bailiang, swallowing tens of thousands of li. 300,000 cavalrymen faced off against the huge Beimang dynasty. They naturally had the courage to match their family background. After receiving this shocking news that was said to be discussed even in the palace, he finally had some clues as to why Zhao Xuansu would kill. Zhao Huangchao of Quanglu Mountain, Yuan Tingshan of Mount Huishan, eldest sister of Gongnamdu, was assassinated. The young chief Hong Xixiang went to Wudong, the Taoist master residence's Dragon Pond, the birth of Zhao Xuansu of Mount Longhu, and the disturbance in the martial emperor city. Although there were definitely many hidden secrets and schemes, the main threads were probably not far off. After Su Fengyan came back to his senses, he caught a glimpse of Murong Wuju's rosy cheeks from the corner of his eyes. She was standing by the lake and peeping at him. He thought it was funny and asked, "I heard that Wang Xinji of the martial emperor city has a tall and sturdy figure. He has big ears and round eyes, a beard like a halberd, white hair like snow, and a very fierce aura. He only wears hemp clothes during the cold and summer, but he wears a fur coat during the rainy and snowy weather. He likes to go to the East Sea to hunt jiao whales. Those who are timid would feel their liver and guts shatter just by looking at him." This question put Murong Wuju in a difficult position. She blushed and said softly, "Wuju left the city with your highness at that time. We left in a hurry and couldn't see clearly. I hope your highness can forgive me." Su Fengyan comforted her gently, "I'm just saying it casually. Don't be nervous." Other than Murong Wuju, among the 3 people, Pei Nanwei was very prickly. She didn't have the slightest awareness that she was a sparrow in a cage. She opposed him in almost everything. She felt that she was even more arrogant than the Princess Jing and in Xiangfan City. However, Xu Xiu had been suppressing her recently. She finally became a little more adept at serving people. Although her expression was ugly, it was only Esu. Emperor Murong Tonghuang's temperament was gloomy. He seemed to have a deformed addiction to power. Su Fengyan guessed that the fact that he was the hereditary king of Bailiang was far more intimidating than his own words and deeds. Su Fengyan didn't like Emperor Murong Tonghuang's shrewdness. As for Xu Xiu, she was a woman who had cultivated the ways of the world. She had been in Jianghu and the prince's mansion for a long time. She had already cut her pure and kind heart into pieces and fed it to the dogs. Since the life of this beautiful woman with boundless beauty was even more important than the flesh on her chest, Su Fengyan could hook his finger and they could have sex. However, it was unknown who would take advantage of who at that time. Su Fengyan was not that thirsty. Murong Wuju looked at His Royal Highness, who was standing on the green bamboo. Her eyes were overflowing with undisguised admiration and reverence. Her feelings and thoughts were far simpler and clearer than her brother Murong Tonghuang. Su Fengyan had saved them from the abyss of suffering. Whether she saw injustice on the road or pushed the boat with the current, she firmly remembered this great kindness. Along the way from the Great Bull Gang in Zhenzhou, her emotions rose and fell because of the young heir in front of her. Especially in the martial emperor city, he walked to the top of the city wall with a bowl in his hand and sat cross-legged. He was so romantic and elegant that Murong Wuju felt drunk as if she had drunk a pot of good wine. Until now, she still hadn't recovered. Outside the martial emperor city, Su Fengyan drew his saber and cut open the body of the ancestor of Mount Longhu. She was even more frightened when she saw that. She only had one thought at that time. If he unfortunately died, she didn't want to live. Murong Tonghuang glanced at his sister from the corner of his eyes. He just looked at her with cold eyes. Su Fengyan gathered his fur and was about to go down the mountain. Suddenly, he saw the bamboo door in the center of the lake slowly open. A woman whose figure could only be vaguely seen from the lakeside walked out. Even though it was vague, it still made people's hearts race. Su Fengyan had a few people around him, including Murong Tonghuang, who was also a peerless beauty, not to mention Pei Nanwei, who was a beauty in rouge. However, when the woman appeared in the field of vision, It seemed that half of her charm was taken away in an instant. The woman in the bamboo house in the center of the lake, wearing a wooden hairpin and plain clothes, walked to the mossy stone steps near the lake and squatted down. She picked up a handful of water with both hands and gently moistened her cheeks. Then she turned her head and looked at Su Fingyan from afar. She didn't make a sound. She just quietly looked at this group of uninvited guests. She was always an orchid in a secluded valley, aloof from the world. Su Fingyan, who was wearing a brocade fox fur coat, was stunned. A trace of absent-mindedness flashed through his eyes. For the first time he was hesitant. Pei Nanwei wrinkled her brows. She was faintly unhappy. It was not that she wanted to be jealous of this strange woman, but she had always been proud of her own beauty. She rarely met a match. The woman in the bamboo house had appeared out of nowhere. In the end, Princess Jingyan felt an instinctive sense of crisis. Sure enough, as long as there were people, there was no Jianghu. Su Fingyan let out a long breath. He waved his hand to signal Xu Xiu and the others not to make any moves. He leaped from the bamboo pole under his feet to the bamboo raft. There was no need to row the raft. The bamboo raft cut through the water and leisurely sailed toward the center of the lake. The bamboo raft stopped 3 zhang away from the bamboo house. The woman stood up and looked at Su Fingyan. Her hair was wet from the lake water and stuck to her cheeks. A few drops of water slid down her delicate snow-white skin. She reached out to wipe the water stains on her chin. She didn't say anything. Su Fingyan took the initiative to speak. He smiled and said, "I saw you 3 years ago on the banks of the Luo River. But at that time I was squeezed into a group of young chivalrous men who wanted to express their love for you. I squeezed for a long time before I finally made a bloody path. When I finally emerged, I was tripped by someone and fell flat on my face. I guess you didn't notice me." She thought for a moment and calmly said, "I remember that at that time you were wearing thin clothes." It was an unexpected answer. Su Fingyan said self-deprecatingly, "Thin clothes? I was clearly a beggar in rags. It's a blessing of 3 lifetimes to be able to catch the attention of Mississippi." She saw that Su Fingyan wanted to say something but hesitated. She smiled and said, "My name is Qin Yu." Sure enough, there was a woman on the rouge list who was not inferior to Nan Gong. She was a beauty who was on par with Bai Hu. Su Fingyan's face was gentle, humble and shy. He softly asked, "Miss Qin lives here alone?" She smiled and nodded without any ulterior motives. Su Fingyan responded with an "oh," and gently jumped onto the shore. The next scene shocked the people on the lakeside. They saw His Royal Highness bend down and carry the bamboo girl. They jumped onto the bamboo raft and left the center of the lake. She bent her slender waist and her head was pressed against His Royal Highness' chest. Su Fingyan looked down and the two of them happened to look at each other. She undoubtedly had a pair of eyes full of spiritual energy. His Royal Highness was known to wander among the flowers for more than 20 years and had never tasted defeat. He had seen countless women and had seen all kinds of stunning beauties. But this pair of eyes was the only one that could be compared with his second sister Su Weisheng. The eyes on Bai Huer's face were too cold, just like his saber-embroidered winter-spring thunder in the past. She was incomparably heroic, not delicate and gentle. At this moment she looked up and stared at His Royal Highness, who was extremely daring. There was no shock, fear or shyness in her eyes. There was a hint of anger hidden in the bottom of her eyes, which was enough to make ordinary lechers feel ashamed and hang themselves with their own hair. Unfortunately, she met Su Fingyan, who was used to being lawless. Su Fingyan lowered his head and squinted his eyes. He smiled brightly and heroically said, "I promise to snatch one of the most beautiful women for my brother to be his wife. Sister-in-law, we will be a family in the future." The woman who had been expressionless finally showed astonishment. It was not strange that there were rich sons who snatched women on the street and bandits who kidnapped beautiful women to be their wives. But there was actually a bastard who snatched a beauty to be his sister-in-law in this world. Xu Xiu, who was experienced in the ways of the world, blinked her eyes and raised the corner of her mouth. He could even snatch a woman in such a domineering manner. He was indeed the heir of Bailiang. Chapter 347. An inconspicuous carriage drove into the capital. The coachman was a young Daoist dressed in a plain Daoist robe. He was not very handsome and carried a long sword on his back. His expression was gentle and one could tell that he was a person who was easy to talk to. The city gate had 9 ridges and 10 dragons. It was a magnificent sight. There was only one passenger in the carriage. She sat in a fur coat and leaned against the back of the young Taoist. She listened to the young Taoist talk about the various wonders of the capital. She listened to him talk about how it was connected to Kunlun, how His Majesty the Emperor who oversaw the Hall of Supreme Harmony was from the south, and how the 6 palaces and 7 halls of the inner court were built according to divination. The young Taoist was not old, but the principles he spoke of were not small. He told the beautiful woman that in the end, all the cities under the heavens pursued the realm of mutual penetration between heaven and earth. The woman's face was thin and thin. She was wrapped in a mink fur coat that was not too expensive. She looked like a pretty girl from a middle-class family. The mink fur was messy and was not as beautiful as a fox fur coat. If it was the wealthy women in the capital who liked to compare themselves, they would not wear this kind of mink fur coat unless it was a Guangdong ferret. The woman listened to the young Taoist's gentle nagging and closed her eyes. There was a satisfied smile on her lips. After entering the city, she sniffed and softly said that it smelled good. The Daoist priest turned his head and saw a restaurant. Knowing that she was hungry, he immediately stopped the carriage, jumped down and helped her walk into the restaurant. They chose a seat on the 3rd floor by the window with a wide view. She only ordered a vegetarian dish for herself and a pot of wine for the Daoist priest who accompanied her. This made the waiter, who was greatly disappointed, roll his eyes. He thought that this foreign man and woman were too unsightly. It was not easy for them to come to the capital, but they did not bring more money. The waiter regretted giving up this seat to them. The wine was served first. The Daoist priest poured 2 cups. The vegetarian dish, braised eggplant, was the restaurant's signature dish. She was attracted by this unique fragrance. She picked up a piece with her chopsticks and tasted it. She smiled and helped the Taoist put a piece into his bowl. She smiled and said, "It's delicious." The eggplant is peeled and cut horizontally into 4 pieces. The knife skills are very fine. Half a head of garlic is peeled and smashed instead of mincing it. Then add a small fire and slowly fry it. 3 eggplants are put into the pot. When it is served, it is just right for the 6-inch small plate. The key is to let the bean paste, garlic and eggplant taste complement each other and not overpower each other. Therefore this eggplant is more expensive than the meat. We did not spend money in vain. The waiter was originally a little angry. After hearing the woman's explanation, his mood slightly improved. He thought that this beautiful but sickly woman could be considered an expert. The young Taoist priest tasted it and did not say anything. He only smiled and looked a little silly. The woman took a bite and put down her chopsticks. She looked out of the window and looked at the carriages. She held her cheeks and said regretfully, "According to your Taoist diet, people are born with the qi of heaven and earth. Therefore the seasons are very important. Those dishes have to be done at the right time. I was originally a foodie and was not afraid of getting fat. This season is the best time to replenish my autumn fat. As long as I let go of my appetite when winter comes, no matter how cold it is, I will not be afraid. It's a pity that I don't have any appetite now." The young Taoist priest did not say anything and looked down. During this long journey with her, wherever she wanted to go, he would bring her there. No matter how far away it was, no matter how high the mountains were, he would bring her to see the scenery. He only wanted her to have fun and return. In the Old West Shu, he brought her to see the most spectacular bamboo sea in the world. In the Old West Shu, they went to see the ruins of Shilabi. Further south, he brought her to the nunnery. She asked for a lot, but it was the worst lot. In the far west, there were mountains that could reach the sky. Then she said that she wanted to take a look at the capital. Most of the diners in the restaurant were natives of the capital, and they were the best at hearing rumors. The people under the emperor's feet had a sense of superiority, as if there was nothing in the world that they did not know. The most exciting topic at the moment was the battle between Wang Xinji and the one-armed Li Chungang in the East Sea's martial emperor city. It could be said that it was the most soul-stirring battle in the Jianghu in the past 50 years. Then the young leader of the Wudong Mountain, surnamed Hong, came down the mountain. It was said that he had the magical ability of flying 1,000 miles with a sword. It was rumored that the Taoist priest was an immortal who was reincarnated from ancestor Lu. In an instant, it made the ancestral court of Taoism, Mount Longhu, lose its color. The most sensational thing was that the land Immortal had not been on the mountain for long. He brought a woman to the borders of several fallen countries one after another. Sword after sword, he destroyed the few remaining pillars of fate in the Old West Shu and Dongyue. Later he went west to Kunlun. Hundreds of top Qi practitioners in the world flocked there, hoping to witness the Immortal's majestic spirit when he cut down the fate with one sword. Secret news quickly spread to the capital. When the Daoist slashed out with his sword, the thick pillar of fate that was as thick as a mountain was about to shatter. This made thousands of people in the world dumbfounded. They were all curious whether there was really such an immortal in the world who did not ascend. Someone in the restaurant spat. That Wudong sect leader may look young on the surface, but he's actually lived for several hundred years, at least 300 years, a full 560 years. Someone immediately doubted. Doesn't that mean he's much older than the old sect leader Wang Zhongluo? Since he's so old, why did he only leave the mountain recently? If he really has supernatural powers, how could Mount Longhu be the minister of feather clothes? The person who spoke earlier slammed the table and said angrily, "This spiritual master is worthy of being called the Immortal of Earth. How would we mortals know what he's thinking?" Countless people nodded in agreement. Indeed, that's right. I've heard that the great spiritual masters of the Taoist sects are all lowly and noble. They're determined to be simple and don't care about the false reputation of the mortal world. Hearing all the discussions, the woman who was leaning against the window turned around and looked at the young Taoist priest across the table with a mischievous look in her eyes. The young Taoist priest blushed. Outside the street, the sound of thunder and horse hooves thundered, causing the ground to shake as if there was an earthquake. Chapter 348. The diners at the tables near the windows all looked over and were shocked. It was actually the rarely seen elite imperial palace guards that were moving out, and looking at their posture, it wasn't just a few dozen cavalry. The imperial palace guards had always been the guards of the important areas of the capital, and their battle prowess could be said to be unrivaled. For a moment the streets were heavily guarded, and there seemed to be no end to the cavalry. Not long after, they occupied the entire main road of the capital. Moreover, every single imperial palace guard had their swords drawn and bows drawn. The generals leading them were even the most powerful and influential military generals in the capital. Apart from the armored soldiers, there were also countless imperial palace guards accompanying them, as if they were facing a great enemy. Today's display was terrifyingly grand. Even the Son of Heaven might not be as grand as this when he went on an inspection tour. A few people with discerning eyes could see a trace of heavy wariness, and this made people feel even more chilled. Could it be that there was someone in the world who dared to act rashly in the capital? How many bear hearts and leopard guts did they have to eat, and how many lives did they have to be able to do this? The layman only watched the show, and only the true experts could see the knack of it. Apart from the close to 1,000 imperial palace guards and the imperial palace guards that had almost turned out in full force, there were also dozens of top-notch imperial palace Qi practitioners that held their breaths. The woman sighed and said, "Let's go back." The young Daoist nodded and asked gently, "Where do you want to go?" The woman smiled and said, "To Mount Wudong, the place where we first met. If I don't go, I'm afraid my body won't be able to take it." The young Daoist asked, "Ride a crane out of the city? Or a carriage?" The woman's childish nature came over and she blinked and said, "If we ride a carriage, will it cause trouble for you?" The Daoist shook his head and said softly, "It won't." The woman hesitated for a moment and then slowly stood up. The young Daoist's face reddened and he took the initiative to extend his hand. The woman took it. They walked out of the restaurant together, and when the Daoist with a sword on his back appeared on the street, those top-notch Qi practitioners all took a step back. Even the imperial palace guards that were known for their valiance and fearlessness didn't even dare to breathe loudly. The young Daoist gently carried the woman onto the carriage, and then turned the horse towards the city gate, ignoring the armored soldiers on the street. He held the whip in one hand and the woman's cold hand in the other and said calmly, "Make way." The young Daoist said indifferently, "I don't know your rules. As for your laws, no matter how great they are not as great as the sword behind my back." There was a young soldier beside the middle-aged general who spoke. He held a silver spear in his hand and was about to charge forward when the general reached out to stop him. The woman said gently, "Let's go." The Daoist priest's expression immediately softened. He nodded and held her hand tightly. Almost all the horses on the street knelt down in an instant. People and horses were thrown off their feet. Chaos ensued. There were no rules to speak of. On this day Wudong's Hong Xixiang and Su Jihu left the city. No one dared to stop them. On this day the world learned that the woman who loved to wear red was called Su Jihu. Wudong's little lotus peak. Clouds and mist swirled around. Qin Zhao, Song Jiming and Yu Xingrui, the three most senior Taoist priests of Wudong, stood shoulder to shoulder in the distance, leaving the mountain peak to the couple. The three old men looked at each other in dismay. There was pride, regret and regret. All sorts of feelings welled up in their hearts. Aside from the three young sect leaders Xixiang, there was only Li Yufu, an outsider, who had just joined Wudong. Yesterday the sect leader went up the mountain and told them something. It could be said to be the most unimaginable feat in Jianghu's 500 years of history. No matter how reluctant they were, Qin Yao and the other Xixiang did not want to stop them. The young Daoist priest and the woman in red sat shoulder to shoulder at the bottom of the tortoise camel tablet. She swung her legs. She did not know what he wanted to do. She only looked at the 72 peaks in the sea of clouds and said sadly, "Bull Rider, I might not be able to grow old with you." That year when he was 14 the two of them met for the first time. After they met in Jiangnan she knew that she would not live long. But when she rode the yellow crane she felt that she had no more regrets in this life. He took her to travel all over the world. Seeing that he did not move, she wrinkled her nose and turned her head. She knocked on his head and asked, "What, are you still foolishly waiting to find me in your next life? Are you stupid? Aren't you tired?" The young Daoist priest thought about it and shook his head. Her eyes suddenly turned red. She bit her lip and asked, "Are you going to wait for me?" The young sect leader who rode the bull rubbed the woman's cheeks and wiped away her tears. His eyes were warm as he said, "If I asked you to wait for me for 300 years, would you be willing to wait?" She said without hesitation, "You waited for me for 700 years. If I wait for you for 300 years of course I can." The young Daoist priest who had only held her hand after meeting again, gathered his courage and gently hugged her. He smiled and said, "Okay." She wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "You really are a coward." He asked, "Are you really not going to see the great general and his royal highness?" She smiled and shook her head. "No, I'm afraid they will be sad. I'm afraid they will cry." The young Daoist priest took a deep breath. When the woman snuggled in his arms, the so-called sword of ancestor Lu that was placed horizontally on the edge of the tortoise camel tablet was unsheathed. It shot up into the sky as if it would not stop until it reached the heavenly court. The clouds in the ninth heaven rolled down. The entire Mount Wudong was covered in purple qi. He said loudly, "I was Lu Dongxian 500 years ago. I was Qi Xuanzhen of Mount Longhu 50 years ago. Now I am Hong Xixiang of Mount Wudong. I have cultivated for 700 years. I swear that I am willing to cultivate for another 300 years for the righteous path of heaven and earth. I only hope that heaven and earth will open a path for Su Jihu to ascend." The young Daoist priest's voice was like a great bell that resounded between heaven and earth. "I beg Su Jihu to ascend on a crane." Yellow cranes cried in unison. A red-clothed man rode a crane into heaven's gate. The young Daoist priest who was the reincarnation of ancestor Lu sat down cross-legged. He looked at the falling sword that was destined to kill him and closed his eyes with a smile. Qin Yao and the others could not bear to watch anymore. Tears flowed down their faces. There was a rainbow behind the sword that was borne above the young Daoist priest's head. It spanned across the big and small lotus peaks and was incomparably gorgeous. 1,000 years of cultivation only hoping to meet again. Chapter 349. His Royal Highness and his entourage made a slight turn on their way back and arrived at Guangling River. It was the 18th day of the 8th lunar month. The tide was rising. Tourists came from all over the world. It was an unprecedented grand occasion. After the spring and autumn period was settled, there was no longer the separation of national boundaries. Scholars carrying books to study and wanderers carrying swords to explore the world became more and more unimpeded. At the same time, exploring secluded places and admiring the scenery also became more and more popular. The Guangling Tide, Amei's Golden Buddhist Light, and Wudong's Golden Buddhist Light were known as the three wonders of the age. Great Yanji was the best place to watch the tidal wave. Today there was even a Guangling Navy inspection. King Zhao Yi would personally come to watch. Guangling's rich and powerful officials and dignitaries all brought their families to watch the tidal wave. Compared to the commoners of the common people, although the former were fewer in number, They naturally occupied 70 to 80% of the best viewing spots. They set up a few tables and couches, filled them with good wine, delicious food and fruits. They also invited the famous scholars who had been on good terms with them for generations to chat and laugh together. When the tide gushed into Trumpet Bay, there would be a boat that belonged to the Guangling Navy leading the tide into the bay. Both sides of the bay stretched for 10 miles, and were filled with luxurious carriages and horses. On the Great Yanji reviewing platform, the Prince of Guangling Zhou Yi gave an order. Then small boats could be vaguely seen approaching the head of the tide. The beating of the drums shook the heavens, and the tide and the beating of the drums grew and multiplied together. The people could see a white line moving from east to west on the misty surface of the river. The white rainbow stretched across the river, and the head of the tide also gradually increased in height. When it reached the vicinity of the Great Yanji, it could reach up to 40 feet high, covering the sky and the earth. His Royal Highness came a little late. The suitable viewing spots on the riverbank were already filled with tents or tables. When he heard the deafening cheers, he could already guess that the boat was approaching. He had to abandon the carriage and let Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng stay behind to watch. However, before they left, His Royal Highness smiled and reminded the two retainers that they might as well sit on the roof of the carriage to watch the scenery. Qing Yao was carrying a small jar in her hand, and the scarlet cloud sword that was left behind by LV Qiantang was hanging on her waist. Su Fengyan was walking at the very front. Murong Wuzhu's delicate body was being led by him. With her personality of going with the flow, she might not have the face to call for help even if she got separated. Murong Tonghuang was on the right side. Some lechers who liked to join in the fun and take advantage of women were about to make a move but were slapped or kicked by Murong Tonghuang without hesitation. Most of the lechers who suffered losses wanted to immediately take advantage of this young lady. However, when they saw Su Fengyan's embroidered fox fur coat, they immediately lost their momentum and withdrew their hands in embarrassment. They looked for other targets and picked a few soft persimmons to make a move. Anyway, in the sea of people watching the tide, there were many girls who kept quiet after being bullied. There was no need to hang themselves on a tree. Just like Pei Nanwei, Qinyu, who was abducted from the bamboo forest, wore a dense veil hat on her head. Her figure was enchanting, even surpassing the Murong siblings whose genders were hard to distinguish. However, these two great beauties who were ranked on the Rouge list followed closely behind His Royal Highness. On the right, Murong Tonghuang was slapping the Murong siblings, while on the left, the maid Bluebird was cleaning up the obstacles with her scabbard. No one was able to get close to them. The old man wearing a sheepskin fur coat was responsible for bringing up the rear, so there was nothing for him to do. Most of the time his gaze was on the woman surnamed Qin, or more precisely on her small waist. Even with his 100 years of experience, the old god of swords still had to admit that Su Xiaoxiu's eye for women was even more brilliant than the climb of martial arts. Even Li Chungang was unconvinced by this point. During this period of time, the old god of swords was busy admiring Pei Nanwei's buttocks, Xu Xiu's breasts, and the Murong siblings' twin lotuses on one stalk. It was a feast for the eyes, but the one he saw the most was the unfamiliar woman surnamed Qin, especially her slender and soft waist. It really made the onlookers feel horrified. The charm of a woman could be judged by her spiritual energy, her eyes, her charm, and her waist. If she walked slowly, her waist would sway too much, it would be coquettish and vulgar. However, if it was too small, it would be slightly petty. However, even though Qin Yumei was an absolute beauty, the old god of swords had a tinge of doubt in his heart. The timing and location of her appearance were too coincidental. After being abducted by Su Kei, she had been too calm. She had already exceeded the category of a lady from a respectable family. Observing her aura, this absolute beauty who exuded mystery from head to toe was not a martial artist. After all, how many old dogs like Zhao Xuanzu could exist in this world? What exactly was her backing? Old Man Li squinted his eyes. It was not easy for the group to rush out of the crowd. If they continued forward, they would reach the riverbank that was occupied by the Guangling family. There were many sturdy and stocky servants standing with their arms crossed over their chests, intimidating the common people. Some of the disciples of the great families had hired many famous guests in the Jianghu. They carried swords and sabers with them, looking strong and powerful. The two areas were clearly separated. This was very similar to how the famous scholar Zhou Xian of the Baogua Temple disdained to sit together with the common people. Su Fengnian was probably basking in the light of the beauty beside him. With him as the center, a circle of vacuum was formed around him. At this point, there was no need to stand on tiptoe to watch the tide. Old Man Li stood with his hands behind his back, looking at the line of tide that was as fast as thunder. His expression was bleak. Back then he had looked down on the world with his sword and rode on the head of the tide on the Guangling River. How high-spirited he was. Now that he was old and more skilled at riding on the sword, he did not even have the slightest desire to be the tallest tree in the forest. Chapter 350. This old man who only liked to play with his feet, did not know that after he had done this, he had attracted countless heroes of Jianghu to show off their skills on the Guangling River. There were strong men carrying cauldrons that weighed 1,000 pounds to smash the head of the tide, swordsmen rowing boats to resist the tide, and there were also powerful archers who shot arrows in succession and collided with the tide, creating thousands of ripples. Before Lu Qiantang became famous, he had practiced swordsmanship on the riverside for more than 10 years. Was it not because he admired the sword god Li Chuangong's appearance when he walked the Jianghu with his sword? Unfortunately, after Zhao Yi took over the territory of the Old West Chu, the Guangling navy was like a dragon and a tiger. There were no Jianghu people who dared to show off their skills. The Guangling navy, regardless of size or combat power, was the #1 navy in the dynasty. It was far from the embroidered pillows of the Qingzhou navy that could be compared to them. Once war broke out, they would not even be enough to fill the gaps between Guangling's teeth. Every year during the inspection, other than the great vassal King Zhao Yi who was overlooking all living beings from the top of the Great Yanji, the one who stood out the most would be the Tide Runner, the symbol of the Guangling navy who crossed the river alone on a boat. At this moment, when the people on both sides of the river looked over, the huge boat was light as a feather. A young general stood with his hand on his sword. His armor was bright and he looked valiant and formidable, causing the hearts of countless young ladies to sway. The scholars of the south were like a forest and it was a magnificent sight. If you went to any temple you would see walls full of poetry and calligraphy. Even some shabby inns with holes in the wind and rain could see all kinds of undiscovered essays. Therefore they had seen and heard too many of the literary talents of scholars of the same age. The one in front of them had not even reached the age of 20 yet, but he had been bestowed with the title of Grand Scholar. He also had a wonderful cursive script, known as one-stroke calligraphy. No matter if it was 10 words or 100 words, it was always written with one stroke without any embellishment. In terms of martial prowess, he had once defeated a grand guest of the Guangling prince's household in swordsmanship. This person's literary and martial prowess were top-notch, and he was undoubtedly the #1 talent in Guangling. Even the domineering Guangling heir was willing to become sworn brothers with him and treat him as an elder brother. When the boat sailed past, many tourists who had prepared bonfires and reed flowers threw them into the Guangling River with all their might, praying to the Guangling Dragon King. These people were all men and women from the local noble families or foreign aristocratic families. The most ordinary people could bring was a bunch of reed flowers, and most of them were some distance away from the riverbank. How could they have the guts to throw it into the bonfires? If they did not have enough strength and did not throw it into the Guangling River, they would smash it into the tents of the extravagant descendants, and would be severely beaten. These were just some of the commoners who had the courage to throw the reed flowers. Before they could escape, they were caught by the fierce servants and evil slaves, thrown to the ground and beaten. They did not dare to make a sound and could only crawl back to the crowd with bruises all over their faces. Su Fengnian was originally one of the most famous profligate sons in the dynasty. He did not find it strange and did not have the chivalrous heart to help others when he saw injustice on the road. His ears did not listen to injustice, and he only pursed his lips and walked forward quietly with his snow-white fur coat wrapped around him. In front of him were 2 piles of aristocratic families, and a few well-built servants came forward to block his path. Blue Bird used her scabbard to slap them away without a word, and they spun twice in the air before falling to the ground and fainting on the spot. Su Fengnian paid no attention to the clamor of the aristocratic families of Guangling. He walked to the riverbank and happened to see a stream passing by. He took the jar and scarlet cloud sword from Blue Bird and threw the jar containing Lu Qiantang's ashes into the river. With a toss of his sword, he hit the small jar and the ashes scattered into the water. Su Fengnian did not mourn the death of Lu Qiantang, but since he had agreed to that Dongyue swordsman's dying wish, he had to fulfill it. Su Fengnian clapped his hands and squatted down. Looking at the surging tide, he said softly, "They say that if a hero doesn't die, his name will rise. No wonder you were cursing loudly before you died." Su Fengnian stood up and found that Qin Yu was looking at the back of the man on the bai and warship. With the veil covering her face, he could not see her expression, but it gave him a strange feeling. Su Fengnian glanced at the aristocratic children of Guangling who were still chattering. When they subconsciously shut up in shock, he turned to the silent woman and joked, "What's wrong? Do you have a lover?" She shook her head indifferently and said, "He once mentioned that calligraphy and swordsmanship were similar and that his views were unique. Cursive calligraphy leaves less white but more white space and more white space but more dense. The strokes open and close, gathering and dispersing. When used in swordsmanship, it is magnificent and magnificent. Why don't—" Su Fengnian interrupted her ungracefully, "Armchair strategist, so boring." Qin Yu stopped talking and dismissed it with a laugh. Playing the lute to a cow. Although Su Fengnian was narrow-minded, he still had some self-awareness left. He said self-deprecatingly, "We are indeed not on the same path. Qin Yu, since we are already a family, why don't you tell me frankly, do you have a sweetheart?" Qin Yu asked calmly, "If you do, will you kill him?" When Su Fengnian heard the word kill coming out of the beautiful woman's mouth, which was full of killing intent, he laughed shamelessly and said, "I like your temperament. You're perfect to be my younger brother's wife." Qin Yu looked at the great Yanji, where there was a bloated man whose robe was almost torn apart. She sighed for no reason. Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Don't scare me. Are you related to the Prince of Guangling Zhao Yi?" Qin Yu's expression was normal and she did not say anything. Su Fengnian put his hands into his sleeves and said softly, "Let's go back to Bailiang." Qin Yu did not move. She hesitated for a moment and said, "Someone wants me to go to the capital. You can't stop him." Su Fengnian stopped and said with a playful look, "Who is it that opens his mouth like a toad and wants to swallow the sky and spit out the earth?" Qin Yu stared at his Royal Highness' face and did not seem to be joking at all. Su Fengnian's expression became strange. Qin Yu bent down and picked up a bunch of reed flowers on the ground and threw them into the Guangling River, saying, "When I was 3 years old, my fate was calculated by Mount Longhu and the imperial astronomer together. I was born as a laurel and entered the temple." The old man with a sheepskin fur coat who had been watching coldly said, "You are either the empress or the imperial concubine." "Oh," Su Fengnian said and did not continue. Chapter 351. Every time the head of the tide moved forward a certain distance, the scholars who were served by beautiful maids, brushes and ink, would finish writing a poem. They would then have their friends recite it out loud. After winning the applause of the audience, they would then throw the poem along with the rice paper into the Guangling River. Although it was said to be impromptu, everyone knew that these meticulously crafted poems had already been prepared. Some of the noblemen who did not have enough ink in their stomachs would rack their brains for a long time before watching the tide. Some of the more unscrupulous ones would simply throw gold and silver to buy some from the scholars of the Han family. The price of each word would depend on how generous the buyer was and the quality of the seller's words. The lowest price would be a dozen taels of silver, and the highest price would be a basin full of gold. In his early years, the heir of Bailiang was the most famous sucker in this line of work. When he heard the endless chanting that followed the tide, he naturally knew the knack of it. There were constantly scholars who spoke eloquently and fluently, echoing the majestic military posture of the navy on the Guangling River. It really did have the flavor of a flourishing dynasty. It was very capable of making the common people submit to the might of the vassal King Zhao Yi. Su Fengnian did not let Qin Yu get to the bottom of the matter as he wished. He only raised his head and glanced at the Prince of Guangling Zhao Yi. Looking at the blurred figure, he really looked like a small mountain. Under this fat pig, there were 2 empresses of the fallen spring and autumn kingdom. As for the princesses and concubines that were reduced to prisoners, there were even more that could not be counted with one's fingers and toes. When Zhao Yi took the order to hold the line in Guangling, it was rumored that every few days, there would be noble ladies from the royal family who could not bear the humiliation and would jump into wells, swallow hairpins or hang themselves. His notoriety spread throughout the dynasty and was on par with Bailiang's Chu Lushan. However, if one thought that Zhao Yi was just a lecherous man who defiled the women of the nobility, one would have underestimated this king who weighed more than 300 pounds. The Baron Bailiang where Su Xiao was from and the Baron Southern Tang where Yen Xi was from had a valiant culture. Bailiang was even under the control of hundreds of thousands of people. However, to be fair, Guangling, which was the old land of West Chu and East Yu, was the most difficult to pacify. The scholars of West Chu were unparalleled in the world and there were many famous scholars. If Guangling King Zhao Yi didn't have any real ability and only knew how to suppress bloodshed instead of winning over the people's hearts, Guangling, which was rich with taxes, would have been devastated long ago. This was tantamount to a disaster for the empire's financial operations. Although the current emperor's brothers weren't all great talents, none of them were mediocre. The Liang dynasty was able to conquer the world not only because of fate, but also because of the Zhao family's manpower. Just as His Royal Highness had completed the Lu Qiantang and was preparing to leave the riverside, an untimely sound of horse hooves suddenly sounded. Turning his head to look, Su Fengnian frowned. There were actually dozens of light cavalry in bright armor galloping over, forcibly cutting through the sea of people to create a path. Many commoners who could not dodge in time were sent flying by the warhorses on the spot. There were more than 30 cavalrymen with exquisite horsemanship, carrying sabers and crossbows. They were very eye-catching and it was their instinct to seek advantages and avoid disadvantages. 100 steps in front of Su Fengnian, the commoners who were watching the tide had already moved aside to create a path for 2 horses to ride side by side. The leader of the cavalrymen with a strong physique was holding a pitch-black snake spear. His face was ferocious as he stared at Su Fengnian who was standing on the riverside. Suddenly he increased the strength of his horse's abdomen and accelerated forward. At this critical moment, a young child who might have been separated from his parents fell onto the road for some reason and sat on the ground, crying loudly. The cavalryman with the spear did not have the slightest intention of reining in his horse. He only had a ferocious smile on his face which made one's hair stand on end. On both sides of the horse path were the children of Guangling's landowning households and the commoners. No one dared to be unlucky. Firstly, everyone knew that the Guangling Prince's Falcon Battalion was responsible for the safety of the land. Secondly, even if they wanted to do something, they really did not have the strength to do so. Guangling's scholars did not have the strength to stop a galloping warhorse. Were they in a hurry to be reincarnated? How could a scholar's brush resist a warrior's spear? At this moment, a young man who looked like a wanderer among the crowd shouted, "No!" He pressed his hands on the shoulders of the 2 people in front of him and jumped up high, wanting to stop the horse and save the child. This chivalrous Wulian man was obviously from outside and had underestimated the terrifying strength of the general on the horse as well as the coldness of the Guangling king's armored soldiers. Before he could save the child, a spear was raised and pierced through his chest. It was as if the man had directly collided with the tip of the spear, piercing his heart and causing his blood to splatter everywhere. The poor wanderer who had just begun his journey in Jianghu was instantly killed. With a pull of the iron spear, the corpse fell back into the crowd. In the blink of an eye, the horse's hoofs the size of a bowl were about to step on the child's body without hesitation. The galloping horse's hoofs could easily create 2 bloody holes in the child's body. There were those who could not bear to watch and those who were watching with their eyes wide open. There were those who could not bear to watch, those who widened their eyes with relish, and those who were only filled with shock and fear. After the horseman killed the child and pulled out his spear, he cast a piercingly cold look at the young man in the distance. However, his pupils violently contracted, and he was 100 times more surprised than when he had dealt with the reckless Jianghu youth. In the eyes of the crowd, they could only see the handsome young man wearing a brocade robe and a white fur coat. The tips of his feet were like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water. After touching the ground a few times, he arrived behind the crying child. He bent down and grabbed the child's collar towards his chest. Then he came to a swift and unrestrained stop. His slender body slightly leaned back, but his footsteps did not stop. He faced the general on the horse and swept backwards. The general was filled with a sense of mania and anger. How dare this kid show off his chivalrous demeanor in front of his spear? The general on the horse raised his iron spear again. Borrowing the horse's momentum, he thrust it towards the young man's chest. He shouted, "You're looking for death." The young man did not seem to use any force. but his retreating speed suddenly increased to the extreme. He was as swift as a rainbow and immediately pulled away from the horse for a long distance. He placed the frightened and dazed child beside a female servant dressed in green. Contrary to everyone's expectations, after the young man who had forcefully seized the opportunity to save the child, not only did he not stop while he was ahead, but he shook his shoulders and the fox fur coat he was wearing was shaken out of his body. The female servant dressed in green clothes and embroidered shoes gently caught it. He himself once again rushed forward. The spear came with a menacing momentum. The young man who had just displayed a method to save the child was like moving clouds and flowing water, and it was pleasing to the eye. Now he expressionlessly held the spear's tip. Without saying a word, he suddenly pulled it back. This actually encouraged the horse to charge forward with a thunderous momentum. The next moment, everyone's eyes widened and their hearts surged. The young man who looked like an elegant young man from an aristocratic family, far more than a Jianghu wanderer, suddenly stopped. He leaped up slightly, pressed down on the horse's head and pressed it down. Chapter 352. Countless onlookers gasped at the same time. After a high-quality warhorse weighing at least 2,000 jin was intercepted, it could not move forward an inch. The horse's head smashed into the ground, its front hooves smashing into the stone floor. With a snap, the horse's sturdy rear half was twisted, and the general on the horse was thrown far away with his spear. With his ability, he should not have been in such a sorry state. It was only because this young master's methods were too unimaginable that he was capsized in the smelly ditch. The general was about to use the spear to get up when he suddenly felt a cold, murderous intent enveloping his entire body. He was about to disregard his general's demeanor and act shamelessly against the enemy when the delicate and sweet-looking maid in green raised her foot and kicked his head into the ground. He died in an even more miserable state than the wanderer. The outstanding horsemanship of the rest of the horsemen was displayed incisively and vividly at this moment. They reined in their horses almost at the same time. For a moment the horses neighed loudly and pierced the eardrums. All of this happened in the blink of an eye, and the situation was completely reversed. The young master in embroidered clothes, whose face was as cool as water, patted his hands lightly as he looked at the rest of the horsemen who were intertwined with anger and fear. He did not say a word. Some of the young ladies who were carefully watching this scene through the gaps of the human wall were now filled with the face of this young master. After all, to these pretty girls from humble families, the man who was versed in both the pen and the sword on the Guangling River was too unattainable. All of his miraculous deeds were just hearsay. At most, when they read novels like The First Snow, they would be immersed in the sorrowful woman in the novel and shed tears of sympathy. They would not really think that they would be able to spend a night with such a talented young master, and would not really be able to call out to such an infatuated young master. Therefore it was far more unforgettable than witnessing it with their own eyes. That young master didn't seem to have the patience to confront them. He took a step forward and the weakened cavalry subconsciously took a step back. Just as the light cavalry came back to their senses and felt ashamed and angry, a series of heavy horse hooves sounded. The cavalry heaved a sigh of relief, knowing that the main character had arrived, and they all made way. A Fergana horse with a light golden mane slowly galloped over. With its outstanding leg strength, it shouldn't be so difficult. However, the person on the horse's back was shockingly heavy. His appearance seemed to be carved from the same mold as Zhao Yi, the Prince of Guangling. He couldn't be called ugly but rather bloated. The horse's back was bumpy, and even his exquisite and cumbersome clothes couldn't hide the trembling of his fat. There were no more than 100 Fergana horses in the dynasty at most. Excluding the 20 or so in the imperial city, half of the number was divided among the officials, nobles, relatives of the imperial family, generals and officials. As a result, outside of the imperial city, no matter who it was, even if it was a dog, as long as they had the right to sit on a horse that was oozing blood after a long journey, there would be a large number of people willing to acknowledge them as their ancestors. Behind the Fergana horse, there was also a precious green horse that couldn't be bought with money. Sitting on it was a haggard old man dressed in gray, and his eyes were like knives. Below the two horses there was a servant. When the horse stopped, this person quickly stood on tiptoe and whispered to his master, pointing at the Murong siblings. He didn't take the young master who dared to compete with the cavalry of the Peregrine Falcon Battalion seriously at all. As a servant he was like this, not to mention the fat man. From the beginning to the end he didn't look at the guy whose actions were shocking enough. He just smiled and stared at the women whose figures were more enchanting than the other. His eyes were as big as copper bells, and he even forgot to use his sleeve to wipe away the saliva at the corner of his mouth. It was a pity that his expensive clothes were made by the dignified craftsman Su. Everyone sighed in their hearts. When this notorious master arrived, even immortals wouldn't be able to survive in Guangling. For a moment when they looked at the handsome young master again, they could only sneer. The human heart was full of ups and downs. How wonderful it was. The fat man finally remembered to wipe away the saliva that was drooling from his mouth. He waved his hand and said, "Snatch." The servant's greatest skill in life was to flatter and curry favor. When he heard that his master had issued the imperial edict, he changed his original humble posture and straightened his back. He hurriedly turned his head to look at the Peregrine Falcon Battalion cavalry who were incompetent and scolded, "A bunch of useless things. Didn't you hear His Royal Highness's words? Quickly snatch." In Guangling, which encompassed the entire Old West Chu dynasty and a small part of Dongyue, the scholarly spirit of the scholars could be said to be the most important in the world. Although in these years under the rule of the Guangling king, there were descendants of powerful families who bullied men and women, which was reasonable, most of these filthy acts would not be so brazen. No one would be foolish enough to do things under the noses of the countless aristocratic families who were watching the tide viewing ceremony. The 30,000 students of the Imperial College in the capital, excluding the Gangnam-do, were mostly scholars from Guangling. In addition, the old Grand Tutor of West Chu, Sun Shiji, who was in charge of a province under the title of Left Servant Shi, had become the stabilizing force in the hearts of the scholars of Guangling. Generally speaking, no matter how lawless the scholars were, they would have to think twice before committing crimes. But in Guangling there was only one exception, and that was the eldest son of the first wife of Zhao Yi, Zhao Yuang. He was a classic example of a tiger father, a dog son. He did not inherit the shrewdness of his father, and only learned Zhao Yi's lustfulness and gluttony. He bullied and humiliated women, and in terms of numbers he could be said to have surpassed his father. Last year he had his eyes on the daughter-in-law of a Linqing county chief and chased her through 2 counties. In the end he broke into the manor with a gang of vicious servants and stripped the young lady of her clothes. The matter was brought to the Guangling king's side. In the end, the dignified 4th-rank county chief with an embroidered sparrow on his chest was killed on the spot by Zhao Yi with a jade rui. Immediately after, an official who had gone to the capital to file a complaint was intercepted and killed on the way out. How could the domineering father and son of Zhao Yi and Zhao Yuang not be chilling to the bone? Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Zhao Yuang, you want to steal my women?" His Royal Highness, Zhao Yuang, made a sound of surprise and seemed to find it interesting. His fat body leaned forward slightly as he finally noticed this outsider. He asked a question that was very much in line with his style. "You know this heir? Do we know each other very well?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Not very well." Zhao Yuang rolled his eyes and said, "Then what are you talking about? Don't worry, this heir is not an unreasonable person. I'm in a good mood today, so after stealing a few of your women, I'll return a few of your servant girls that this heir is tired of playing with." Su Fengnian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Why was this fat pig so different from Jinggan heir, Zhao Sun? He was twice the weight of the latter, but the meat in his head was probably not even the size of Zhao Sun's finger. He believed that if it weren't for Zhao Yi, the prince of Guangling's protection, he wouldn't even be able to sell these 300 caddies of meat for much money. Zhao Yuang pursed his lips and muttered to himself, this heir only admires one person in this lifetime, and that is Beiliang's Su Fengnian brother Su." His Royal Highness said in a bad mood, "Why aren't you scramming? This heir is giving you a lot of face by stealing your women. If you don't know what's good for you, I'll skin you and throw you into the Guangling River." Chapter 353. When interacting with His Royal Highness, it could not be said that one is marked by the company one keeps, but it could be said that one is marked by the company one keeps. Presumably, Su Fengnian would also pinch his nose and admit it. Ever since she met His Royal Highness by chance at the border of Jianzhou, the timid Murong Wuju was not afraid in this situation, even if she had vaguely guessed the terrifying identity of this fat piece of meat. It was hard to imagine that this girl would have accepted her fate of going to Mount Hui to become the bed toy of a 100-year-old man. In her previous life, even though she was born into a noble family in the Sword Province, A county magistrate was already a powerful official to her. In just a few days she had climbed Mount Insignia and paid a visit to the martial emperor city. It was as if she had lived enough for her entire life. When Su Fengnian brazenly pressed down the horse's head and saved the child, Murong Wuzhu felt that out of the millions of people in the world, meeting him alone was enough. However, she could not help but feel sad. She was not as intelligent as her younger brother, the Emperor of Tong. She was not as beautiful as Pei Nanwei. She was not as powerful as Sister Bluebird. What could she do for him? While Murong Wuzhu was inexplicably sad, a middle-aged woman staggered out of the crowd and hugged the child tightly. However, she did not shed tears of gratitude to His Royal Highness for saving her child. Instead, she knelt down with a plop and kowtowed to Zhao Yu, who was sitting on a Fergana horse in the distance. She cried that she did not know this group of people and that the child had disturbed the important military affairs of the soldiers. This commoner begged His Royal Highness for forgiveness. She kowtowed non-stop until her forehead was bruised. The onlookers looked at each other and felt relieved. This was how it should be. They did not feel that there was anything wrong with this young woman's ingratitude. Under the jurisdiction of Guangling, everything was decided by the Guangling prince. Law. Was this not the family law of the Zhao clan? Some young scholars who were secretly jealous of Su Fengnian's elegance were waving their fans. Some were whispering and guessing how Su Fengnian would end up tragically. They were in a very good mood. Murong Wuzhu had just come out of the fire pit. Although she was similar to Zhou Xian and had stumbled into Bailiang's dye vat, her temperament was still as pure as Bai Xian, who had never put pen to paper. When she heard the woman's heart-wrenching words, she was so angry that her face turned red. She jogged over and slapped the woman's face. Murong Wuzhu did not know how to reprimand her. The woman was stunned by the slap and stopped crying. Instead, it was Murong Wuzhu who began to cry. A hesitant scholar with a headscarf shrunk behind his head and did not dare to appear. He should be the woman's husband. When he saw this beautiful girl slap his wife's face, his face began to burn. However, in the end he did not have the courage to walk out. He carefully glanced at His Royal Highness Zhao Yu on the other side of the horse and then looked at the handsome young master below the horse. He only hoped that these important people whom he, a small commoner, could not afford to offend, would not harm his family of three. He was even more regretful that he had come to watch the show. Su Fengnian turned his head to look at Bluebird, who was holding the fox fur coat. Without saying anything, Bluebird, who had a telepathic connection, came in front of the trembling woman and said coldly, "Go." The woman, whose legs had turned to jelly, got up in a panic. She pulled the child and squeezed into the crowd without looking back. After meeting with her husband, she squeezed through the crowd and returned home. From the beginning to the end, she did not look at the young master. As for whether she felt guilty or glad, only God knew. Those who had some status in Guangling all knew that every time there was a large gathering, Heir Zhao Yu would definitely place many scouts who were specifically responsible for finding beautiful women. These lackeys had a very good sense of smell and would usually be able to bring His Highness back with a full load. Otherwise, with Zhao Yu's physique, whether it was by carriage or by horse, how difficult would it be for him to travel? Other than tirelessly hunting for women, Zhao Yu was also quite good at making money. There was a housekeeper in his residence who was responsible for commenting on the appearance of the women in the surrounding families. If they did not want to be brought back to the Guangling prince's residence and pressed under his crotch, they had to offer him a large amount of silver. Even the eldest son of Provincial Governor Zhou, who practically grew up together with His Royal Highness, could not escape this calamity. Just because he had a wife who was of equal social status and was beautiful and attractive, he had to pay 70 to 80,000 taels of silver as a tribute, without missing a single copper coin. He only dared to privately joke that His Royal Highness was very fair and honest. From this, it could be seen that Zhao Yu's table manners, whether it was eating women or eating silver, it was hard to see what kind of realm he was in. But Guangling Prince Zhao Yi liked it very much. He joked that this eldest son of the Di was a little Taotai and that it was a great blessing to be able to eat. When Heir Zhao saw that the person in front of him did not move, his already pitiful patience completely dissipated. He made a hand gesture and no longer paid attention to his peers in front of him. He only raised his head and craned his neck to look at Murong Wuzhu. He swept his eyes over them. They were actually a pair of beautiful sisters. There was actually such a beautiful pair of twin lotuses on one stalk. The heavens were not unkind to this heir. He narrowed his eyes and looked more and more pleasantly surprised. There were also two women wearing veiled hats. Although he could not see their faces clearly, just by looking at their figures he could see that they were extremely enchanting. As for the delicate female servant in green, her temperament was also very good. What was going on today? Why was he so lucky? These extraordinary girls were enough for this heir to deal with half a year of boredom. Zhao Yu's saliva was dripping as he clicked his tongue and said, "Young ladies, quickly come into this heir's bowl. This heir loves beauties the most. I will definitely eat and taste them slowly." Chapter 354. Su Fengnian saw the gray-robed elder dismount from his horse and was about to make a move. He finally opened his mouth and said, "Zhao Yuang, let me say this first. You can steal my women, but when the time comes before the beauty has even entered your bowl, a few caddies of meat from your body have entered my bowl." For the first time His Royal Highness looked seriously at this outsider. He was used to the cries and screams of kidnapped women and their families, so it was really boring. This made His Royal Highness feel a kind of loneliness of a master. Within Guangling, who was not scared out of their wits when they saw the formation behind him. Occasionally there was a noble family that did not lack backbone, but after a futile resistance and a bloody suppression, they would talk nonsense like retribution. There really was no hero who could speak without their lips trembling in front of him. He remembered that a few years ago, there was a pair of immortal heroes who were said to have traveled to Guangling. At first, His Royal Highness did not bring many retainers and suffered a small loss. He immediately returned to his residence and brought a dozen or so guests and 300 cavalry to block the escape pair at the border. First he had an erotic scene in front of the hero, then he had skinned her husband in front of the heroine. Finally he had used a spear to pierce their bodies and skewered them together. With good intentions he had let them die together. To this day His Royal Highness still remembered the mournful eyes of the plump heroine and the hateful tears of the so-called hero. Zhao Yuang smacked his lips. It was really exciting. This was much more enjoyable than when he usually doted on the women of other families. The aftertaste was really endless. When Zhao Yuang thought of this, his eyes burned with even more passion for the women. He began to think of a few new tricks that he had thought of but had not yet implemented. As he thought and thought, he habitually put a finger into his mouth and mumbled, "It is a pity that I do not have the opportunity to see Brother Su. I heard that his Wutong Yuan has many beautiful women. Otherwise I could use them to compare notes. Besides, Brother Su also has two older sisters. I treat you with sincerity and respect and do not mind sharing the women of my family. Presumably, Brother Su should be more generous and give the two older sisters and the entire Wutong Yuan to me." Zhao Yao continued to mumble to himself, "What if he doesn't want to be unkind? What should we do?" His Royal Highness sighed. He pulled out his finger and dipped it in his saliva. His face was full of smiles, but his eyes were gloomy. "Beiliang, so far away. I don't have the strength to travel so far to ask for it. But once I reach Guangling I won't tolerate your stinginess, Brother Su." When he came back to his senses, he saw that the gray-robed elder who had always been successful in his work was already walking towards that person. Zhao Yao cracked his neck and waited in anticipation. Zhao Yao saw that the young man's face was calm as he stretched out his hand towards him. He couldn't help but ask curiously, "What are you doing?" Su Fengnian did not say anything. Murong Wuzhu inadvertently caught a glimpse of Big Sister Bluebird's lips curling upwards. The most unremarkable old man wearing a sheepskin fur coat slowly walked into everyone's field of vision and said in a bad mood, "A good Guangling river. 60 years ago the sky was high and the river was wide. Now it's actually so unlucky. Even this old man can't stand it anymore. Su Brat, that running dog and 30 riders are mine. That dead pig is yours. This old man, let me say this first. If you don't cut off a few pounds of meat from him, don't even think about wasting your energy on this old man in the future." Just as the old man finished speaking, the scene left everyone dumbfounded. The 30 riders and their horses were torn apart by the invisible sword energy. As for the gray-robed guest elder who had the demeanor of an expert, he didn't even have time to open his mouth, let alone move his hand. His head seemed to have been flattened by an invisible weapon. The old god of swords who didn't move continued, "A true expert is coming from the great Yanji. Also, if you don't want to be chased by thousands of armored riders, you'd better act immediately." Su Fengnian smiled. He stretched out his arm and grabbed a sword from the corpse of a rider on the ground. Controlling Qi. Qin, who had been watching the development of the situation from the sidelines, narrowed his eyes. His Royal Highness, who wasn't too stupid, turned his horse around and was about to run away. Where there's life, there's no need to worry about not having a wife. Su Fengnian strode forward and grabbed the horse's tail with one hand, pulling the front hooves of the charging Fergana horse into the air. Zhao Yuao, who needed 3 servants to help him get on the horse, had no horsemanship to speak of. He immediately fell backwards onto the ground. Su Fengnian used the scabbard to stab the neck of this crown prince, who was also an influential member of the dynasty, rendering him unable to move. Su Fengnian then sliced off 3 tails of flesh from Zhao Yao's arm. He said with a smile, "Look, your flesh is in my bowl. I'm not lying, am I?" He wailed like a ghost and howled like a wolf. The second sword cut off 1/2 pound of meat from Zhao Piao's thigh, which was as round as a pillar. It was still a smiling face that could charm women to death. "That's right, I'm your brother Su." The fat crown prince's heart was torn and his lungs were torn. He struggled fiercely. Su Fengnian changed the position of the scabbard and nailed it firmly onto Zhao Yu's head. The crowd could only see the crown prince's limbs rolling about, but his head could not move. Su Fengnian's third sword cut off a piece of meat from Zhao Piao's left cheek. He then smiled and asked, "Does it hurt?" Zhao Piao was scared out of his wits. Su Fengnian made an "oh" sound and cut off his right cheek. "It seems to hurt quite a bit." Zhao Piao's pants were soaked. He foamed at the mouth and fainted from the pain. The old god of swords smiled and said, "Young Su, there's someone coming soon. Take it easy. Leave or stay, you tell me." "Bluebird, go to the carriage and get the embroidered winter spring thunder." After Su Fengnian finished speaking, he turned to Li Chungang and asked with a smile, "Old senior, do you dare to come with me to Yanji to watch the tide?" Li Chungang was stunned. He then laughed loudly and heroically. Back in the day, the Wu family's 9 swords defeated 10,000 cavalry. This old man alone could take on 9 of them. Chapter 355. Qin Yu originally thought that after this person got into trouble, he would run away from Guangling with his tail between his legs. So what if the king of Beiliang was his royal highness? This was Guangling, the territory that the vassal king Zhao Yi had painstakingly managed for 20 years. He had accumulated great power. According to the laws of the vassal states, the king of Yan and the king of Guangling were not allowed to meet the king of Beiliang. Unfortunately, Zhao Yi was one of the 7 vassal kings. Other than the most powerful navy in the world, Guangling also had a considerable number of elite cavalry. Among them, the 8,000 personal guards of the king of Beiliang were the best of the best. They were as fast as an arrow and fought like thunder and lightning. The commander of the cavalry, Lu Xingxiang, and the general Zhang Erbao, were publicly recognized as enemies of 10,000 people in the Liang dynasty. Their reputations were comparable to that of Su Zhao's 5 foster sons, other than Qin Zhibao. Among them, Lu Xingxiang first went down to Luzhou on a snowy night in the spring and autumn period, and then his cavalry crossed Dongyue. His military service was illustrious. The great general Gu Jiantang broke up his old subordinates and only brought his direct subordinates into the Ministry of War. All the military power fell into the pockets of the king of Yan and the king of Guangling. The dozens of provincial governors did not dare to ask for a single soldier. In terms of military service and strength, the king of Guangling, Zhao Yi, could not compare to the vassal king Su Shao of a different surname. However, a strong dragon could not fight a local snake. Moreover, Su Fengnian was at most a young snake crossing the river. How could he compete with Zhao Yi, the giant snake of Guangling who had already become a demon? Forced by the situation, Qin Yu and the maidservant Bluebird walked slowly together. Looking up, the spectators on the shore had all scattered and fled for their lives. The ground was in a mess. They could see a black stream coming from the land. It was the distinctive black horse of the Beiliang army, and its momentum was not inferior to that of the Guangling front line. Qin Yu frowned. Had this Su Fengnian lost his mind? She did not dislike his cruel method of teaching the crown prince Su Fengnian a lesson. Evil people would be dealt with by evil people. The grudges between the top playboys were mostly not tender feelings. However, Su Fengnian was in a dangerous situation and yet he went against the current. This was not a rational thing to show off. This was not the way. Did he not understand such a simple principle? Qin Yu snorted coldly and smiled coldly. It was really a pity that the grass snake's gray line had been hidden for thousands of miles. It had just left the garden and the grass hut, but it was going to be cut off by the Guangling River. Xu Xiu and Yang Qingfeng had no reason to stay out of the matter. Blue Bird held a spear. The three of them pulled away from His Royal Highness and the old man wearing the sheepskin fur coat. Since they had abandoned the carriage, Blue Bird did not forget to let Xu Xiu bring along Dong Tai's sword case. The two in front were prepared to face the first wave of cavalry head-on. He was really too arrogant. His Royal Highness moved forward confidently, with two swords hanging from his waist and the hilts in his hands. Although his face was slightly pale and he did not look well, no one doubted that His Royal Highness was just a sickly person after he pressed down on the horse's head and used his qi to control objects. The one-armed old god of swords. Since today's battle would most likely be the last time he fought in the world, there was no harm in piercing through the sky. Back then, the Sword Emperor of Shishu had killed thousands of cavalry and died of exhaustion. Li Chungang wanted to teach the martial artists of the world that the peak of swordsmanship was not limited to this. Li Chungang had lived in Jianghu for 100 years with his sword. So what if he had lost 2 battles to Wang Xianji? Was there really no junior swordsman who could pull down the Lord of Martial Emperor City? There was only one Dong Tai. On the great river of swordsmanship there were still too few. Qinyu was the last to leave. At his feet, the fat pig Zhao Yuang, who had fainted, opened his eyes slightly. The 300 gene of meat rolled around as he climbed to his feet at lightning speed. His body was so strong that it made one wonder if their eyes were playing tricks on them. After rising, he ran in the opposite direction of Su Fengnian, running as fast as he could, hoping to leave this place as soon as possible. Seeing all this, Qinyu was slightly stunned. He thought that the Crown Prince of Guangling was not really that stupid. He even knew how to play dead to get away. If he had not made such a fool of himself, a few more pieces of meat would have been sliced off. Qinyu stopped looking at the pile of filthy fat and turned around to see that His Royal Highness of Beiliang was about to draw his sword. Qinyu sighed in her heart. If she were in his shoes, she would have announced her family name loudly before the crowd dispersed and spread the name of Beiliang, His Royal Highness, all over Guangling. This was the only reason why Zhao Yi did not dare to attack her openly with nearly 1,000 cavalrymen. After all, killing Beiliang's son without permission was a crime that was destined to cause a stir in the imperial court. Moreover, this son was the most important person in the Liang dynasty and was a first-class descendant who had inherited the title of His Royal Highness. However, the opportunity was fleeting. Those spectators, regardless of their family background, did not even have the courage to watch the fun. Even if they knew the inside story later, they were not qualified to be witnesses. Who would risk their lives to tell the imperial court? Qinyu, whose origin was unknown, had complicated thoughts. She remembered the back of young master by Qiu, who threw the altar and the sword. At that time she vaguely heard a sentence. She murmured to herself, "It's true that a hero's name will rise after his death. But this is the way a hero will cut off all means of retreat and sink all boats. You clearly have the potential to become an ambitious and ruthless marquis who occupies the north and swallows the south. Why are you so reckless? I thought you were a loser on the outside but a loser on the inside. I didn't expect you to be a loser on the inside." On the Great Yan Dynasty's reading platform, a large banner with the character, Zhao, was fluttering in the wind. A middle-aged man who was even more obese than Zhao Yu was wearing an embroidered robe with a jade belt and 9 pythons. His robe was embroidered with golden Sichuan brocade. The chair under the man's buttocks was 3 times the size of an ordinary chair. He did not move the mountain. Just by sitting there he was already taller than many of the civil officials of the Great Yan Dynasty. The embroidered robe of the dynasty could only be worn by members of the imperial family. Of course, those who raised the banner and rebelled were not included. This embroidered robe, which symbolized the peak of glory, splendor, wealth and rank, was divided into 9 grades. In terms of color, unless it was the crown prince, the vassal kings and ordinary princes would wear embroidered robes of light yellow, blue, or stone green according to the law. At most, the edges of the embroidered robe would be embroidered with gold. However, this small mountain who was in a mess was specially bestowed with a golden embroidered robe of the best quality. It could be said that the heavenly grace was extremely vast and mighty. This was because this vassal king who held great power was born from the same mother as the current emperor. Compared to the other vassal kings, naturally they could not be mentioned in the same breath. The Prince of Guangling, Zhao Yi, was the only existence in the world who could sleep on the same bed as the emperor. In the past, when he hit the head of the county chief with a jade rui, the result was nothing more than a great eunuch from the capital Qiandiao temple, rushing to Guangling to pass on a few words of verbal reprimand for the emperor. Beside the vassal king Zhao Yi, stood an old man who looked like a skinny monkey. He had a mustache and was wearing a first-class robe made by Su Zhonggong, but his appearance was really ugly. On the other hand, there was a middle-aged general on the right side of Zhao Yi. He looked dignified and handsome, standing with his hand on his sword. It could be seen that the vassal king trusted this general very much. This man was the famous general of the present age, Lu Xingxiang. He was a crafty commander and was especially good at using a small number of elite cavalrymen to raid thousands of miles away, winning the victory by surprise. Half of the merit of the fall of Dongyu should be credited to Lu Xingxiang. Lu Xingxiang, who came from a cold family, had a very good reputation both in the army and in the scholarly circles. It was unknown why he always stayed in Guangling. When Gu Jiantang entered the capital with 12 cavalrymen, there should have been Lu Xingxiang. These years, there was often a rumor that Lu Xingxiang would go to the capital to serve as the assistant minister of the Ministry of War. After 5 or 6 years of hard work, when Gu Jiantang reached a higher level, he would take over as the Minister of War. It was not until this year that the Tongxi sword Immortal Lu Baijie of Huding County appeared out of nowhere and became the assistant minister of the Ministry of War that the court and the common people stopped guessing and clamoring. The shifty-eyed old advisor of the Prince of Guangling stretched out his orchid fingers to twirl his beard, and said in a strange tone, "Xingxiang, you overestimate this Bailiang heir. If you had known earlier, you could have slowly swallowed him like a cat catching a mouse." The moment the Bailiang heir and his entourage stepped into Guangling, the secret agent of the Prince of Guangling had already sent the news to the spring snow building of the Prince of Guangling. This spring snow building was an important place for the Prince of Guangling's military. All matters, no matter big or small, within the jurisdiction of Guangling originated from this building. Therefore, the Guangling officialdom viewed this building as a big dragon gate. To be able to enter this building and meet with the Prince of Guangling Zhao Yi proved that this official had truly stabilized his position in Guangling. To be able to give advice to Zhao Yi, who had just become the Guangling Jidushi, meant that this person was already a powerful official within Guangling. He was so popular that he was almost purple. Compared to those provincial governors who had the titles of feudal officials, he was even more frightening. Chapter 356. Today, when the Su Fingyan came to watch the battle, the direct descendants of the vassal kings and the advisors on the spring snow building all responded with a cold and indifferent strategy of not trying to win him over or beat him. It was just that His Royal Highness Zhao Yu had disrupted their plans. To the shadow bigwigs of Guangling in the spring snow building, this was nothing much. Most of them were young men who had only found a place in the building in the last 20 years. They did not have much reverence for Su Shao, who had a different surname. A few of the more radical advisors had been sparing no effort in advocating for the Bailiang cavalry to be used as a stepping stone for the mighty army of Guangling. Therefore, when he heard that His Royal Highness had led 30 riders to pick a fight and was unexpectedly cut off by the Su Fingyan as a demonstration, even Lu Xingxiang was somewhat angry. He immediately proposed that before the heir of Bailiang had revealed his identity to protect himself, he should use more than 1,000 armored cavalry to charge forward with a thunderous attack. Even if the heir of Bailiang had the world-famous old sword god Li Chungang from the martial emperor city to protect him, and even if not a single one of the 1,000 Bailiang cavalry was left alive, he could still deploy another 3,000 armored cavalry to kill a young man who would one day inherit the title of the king of Bailiang, and at the same time kill a famous swordsman of Jianghu. Lu Xingxiang believed that his master had the courage to risk 1,000 or 2,000 Bailiang cavalry. Others did not know the hidden intention of the emperor of the capital, but the famous general Lu Xingxiang, who was well versed in military affairs and government affairs, had stood tall on the spring snow building for more than 20 years without falling. His position had always been one of the top 3. How could he not understand the bottom line? Perhaps because of today's turmoil, lame Su of Bailiang would fly into a rage. Once this happened, the capital would issue an edict, and it was even possible that the Prince of Guangling would be demoted by 1 rank. However, temporary gains and losses could not be disrupted. In the midst of the imperial court's intrigue or the war between the two countries, it could be ignored. Su Shao had spent most of his life in the military and had suffered countless injuries. Now that he was over 50 years old, how much longer could he live? So what if I give you lame Su 20 years? By that time Bailiang will fall apart. His master won't even be 60 years old. More importantly, he will have a long line of descendants. Lu Xingxiang dares to say that by that time, not only will Prince Guangling Zhao Yi regain his throne, His Royal Highness will also be able to obtain a dream of hereditary succession. Bailiang was powerful like a giant python entrenched in the northern border. The only fatal weakness was that the king of Su only had 2 sons. The youngest Su Longxiang was an idiot. Once the eldest Su Fengnian died, Su Shao had the ability to topple the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn, but did he have the ability to go against the heavens? Unless it was a saint of the 3 sects who was like an immortal on earth, 100 years of youth would be nothing more than a skeleton. This had been the case since ancient times. People kept saying long live the son of heaven, but who could truly live forever? Lu Xingxiang didn't quibble with the rat-bearded strategist and said calmly, "If that Su Fengnian wants to die, can you and I stop him?" The wretched-looking great advisor of the Wang mansion chuckled. His eyes were unusually sharp. You can't judge a book by its cover. When Lu Xingxiang proposed to use 1,000 cavalry to kill Su Fengnian, he was not sure if Zhao Yi had the patience to wait for 20 years. But in fact this great vassal king not only asked Zhang Erbao to lead the army, but also asked someone to bring the tiger talisman to Shangwei's camp, and ordered the rest of the Bailiang army to move out in full force. Such decisiveness and ruthlessness had moved even Lu Xingxiang, who had killed countless people. After killing the only son of Bailiang, it meant that Guangling and the Bailiang cavalry would become mortal enemies. If Guangling army and Bailiang cavalry were to fight on the battlefield, both Guangling and Guangling would lose. Zhao Yi only had 2 big backers, his elder brother who shared the same father and mother in the capital city, and the thousands of miles of rivers and mountains of Liang dynasty between Bailiang and Guangling. With just a few words, a few people had decided the direction of the dynasty for the next 20 years. Lu Xingxiang listened to the sound of rolling tides. His mind was not as calm as his face and tone. This was power and influence. Women were as beautiful as a painting, polished with their bare hands and added fragrance to their sleeves. How could they be compared to being the leader of a beautiful country? Prince Zhao Yi of Guangling rested his elbow on the arm of the chair, holding his chin and face. He could not imagine that the skin of a man who weighed nearly 400 pounds was as white as snow. He said with a smile, "Traveling with those few women in Jianghu is like a 3-year-old child holding gold in the market. How could they not attract the attention of bees and butterflies? Piaoer has always had a good taste. Don't blame her for the loss this time. This king has underestimated the courage and insight of the children of Su family. Indeed, to be able to kill scholars in Gangnam-do, quarrel with Dragon Tiger Mountain in Mount Hui, and climb to the top of the city wall in Martial Emperor City, even if he is just an embroidered pillow, he should be the craftsmanship of our Guangling craftsmen, right?" Lu Xingxiang did not agree. He just looked at the light cavalry of Bailiang charging like a torrent. Those weak visitors from Bailiang were really like mantises trying to stop a chariot. Those northern barbarians were really spoiled by lame Su. The old advisor with a beard said with a cunning smile, "That little bastard is stupid and bold. With the king's strategy he will never be able to escape from the palm of your hand. Perhaps that little bastard will never believe that the king will not even give face to Su Shao. But I wonder how many times can Li Chungang, who has returned to Jianghu, withstand the charge of 1,000 cavalry?" Lu Xingxiang shook his head and said with a heavy voice, "It is said that Li Chungang has become a land immortal in Mount Hui and is sitting firmly in the realm of sword immortal. In the past, the imperial uncle of West Shu had killed more than 1,000 Bailiang cavalry with a sword. It is not a rumor spread by the people of Jianghu. I think this old sword immortally will be a tough nut to crack." Prince Guangling Zhao Yi smiled and said, "This king has spent a lot of money on 1,000 Bailiang cavalry. It is a pity that it has gone just like that. However, Guangling has been peaceful and boring these past few years. To be able to use 1,000 or a few thousand lives in exchange for some entertainment, it is not a total loss. Xingxiang Zhupa, this is a good show. Watch carefully. Don't squander this king's money." Lu Xingxiang was expressionless. The advisor called Zhupa said with a smile, "I don't have much dealings with the people of Jianghu. Today I must open my eyes and take a good look at the so-called sword immortal and see if he can turn the tide." Zhao Yi snapped his fingers and said self-deprecatingly, "This king does not dare to be careless about the sword immortal's flying sword taking the head. If I am not careful, Li Chungang will take my head in desperation. It will be a big joke. After the snap, an old swordsman with a withered face but a soaring sword aura slowly ascended the stage. His hands were placed on the hilt of his sword. He faced the cavalry and Li Chungang and closed his eyes in concentration. The old man was Chai Qingshan, the last surviving master of the Dongyue sword pool. His swordsmanship was the best in the southeast of the empire. He had blocked countless assassination attempts for Guangling Prince Zhao Yi. The current master of the Dongyue sword pool had no choice but to expel him for the sake of the pool's reputation. The advisor smiled and said, Chai Qingshan, you are also a grandmaster of the sword. Moreover, your senior brother was humiliated by Li Chungang and committed suicide out of shame. When enemies meet, your eyes should be exceptionally red. Why are you so calm? Could it be that you were scared out of your wits by Li Chungang opening the gate of heaven at Donghai? Zhao Yi frowned and said, Zhang Zhupa, don't be so narrow-minded like a woman. Honorable guest Chai only killed your disappointing nephew. It's not a big deal. If you continue to nag, do you believe that this prince will make you fight with honorable guest Chai on the spot? Zhang Zhupa rolled his eyes and gave himself 2 tight slaps on the face. He apologized. I know I was wrong. Chai Qingshan held his breath and did not move. The naval drill on the river went on as usual, but the Guangling riverbank was suddenly filled with turbulence. The vanguard general Zhang Erbao took the lead. He wielded a lance and waved it, splitting the air. The old man with the sheepskin fur coat carried a standard sword for the Peregrine Falcon Battalion cavalry. It was far from being a divine weapon. Looking at the endless Guangling cavalry, a smile appeared on his old face. When I first entered Jianghu, I walked on the Guangling tide with my sword. I only felt that as long as I had a sword in my hand, the world would be free and unfettered. I really miss the feeling of being young and carefree. I'm finally going to enter Jianghu. Fate has brought us together on this Guangling River. Little Su, this old man and you have known each other for a while. We can't be considered friends, but this old man finds you pleasing to the eye. If you fight with all your strength, you will have enough fame, but it may not be a good thing for you to take charge of the Bailiang cavalry in the future. You, His Royal Highness, have to pay attention to concealment. You can only sleep peacefully by pouring dirty water on yourself every day. This old man sees that you are not living at ease. You are very different from us Jianghu people who fish for fame. Therefore in this battle don't blame this old man for stealing all the limelight. If 1,000 cavalry is killed, Zhao Yi won't feel any pain. Just kill another 3,000 or 4,000 cavalry. This old man has to be satisfied. If you are really defeated, you don't have to think about collecting this old man's corpse. Just say that this old man will save his strength to send you out of Guangling before he dies. Su Fengyan smiled and said, Su Xiao once said that it's okay for a man to be cynical about small matters. But when it comes to life and death, one must still do something. There are things that one cannot do. Old senior, if you trust me, just charge forward and leave your back to Su Fengyan. Let's kill our way to Yanji. The old god of swords Li Chungang stopped and scolded jokingly, You know that this old man won't be defeated, so you say such bold words? Su Fengyan said with a wronged face, Old senior, your words are more hurtful than the 2-sleeved green snake. The old man laughed heartily. With a tap of his toes, his body shot forward. He said heroically, Dong Tai, killing with a sword, do you really think that you are stronger than this old man? According to the records of later generations, on the 8th month and the 10th month on the tide viewing day, Li Chungang killed more than 2,600 enemies with one sword. There was no longer the old god of swords and the new god of swords in Jianghu. Blood flowed like a river, but the waves could not wash it away. As they neared Yanji with the crown prince of Bailiang, Su Fengyan smiled and asked Guangling Prince Zhao Yi, If I die, Su Xiao will hang Bailiang swords all over Guangling. Do you believe me? Chapter 357. All good things must come to an end. When the carriage arrived at the barren border between the 2 prefectures, Green Bird stopped the carriage when she heard the slight movement in the carriage. His Highness bent down and lifted the curtain. After getting off the carriage, he looked at the scenery of northern Liang, which was far less beautiful than the south. He was lost in thought. After the frost, the trees withered, the leaves fell, and the insects hid in their holes. Even if there was a gentle breeze outside, it would still carry a chill that could not be hidden by clothes. Lidong was coming in the blink of an eye. When Su Fengyan left, it was already winter when he returned to Liangzhou. During his 3 years of travel he was only at the bottom of Jianghu. Other than bitterness there was only bitterness. This trip seemed to be showing off, but the people he came into contact with were either rich or noble, or the most outstanding grandmasters or freaks in Jianghu. That's right, he was just a small fry who only dared to play in the shallow waters of Jianghu. How could he have the nerve to greet the crown prince of Bailiang who had revealed his identity? Wasn't this just asking for a slap? Su Fengyan turned his head to look at the Murong siblings, Princess Jing'an, and Pei Nanwei, who had gotten off the carriage at the same time. Of course, there was also the sword god who had not gotten off the carriage. In the Battle of Guangling River, in the short 2-li journey, Li Chuangong's sword had killed 2,600 cavalrymen. Layer upon layer there were very few complete corpses. His Royal Highness's robe was soaked with blood. Other than the general who had luckily survived, the rest of the Guangling soldiers had all died. Perhaps Prince Zhao Yi of Guangling was intimidated by Li Chuangong's words. Let this old man kill 2,000 steel cavalry to satisfy his craving, and before he dies he will drag a king of Guangling down with him. Even if he dies he will have no regrets. Or perhaps his plan was disrupted by Li Chuangong's threat. In any case, no matter how the small mountain of white flesh thought about it, in the end he did not stop Su Fengyan from leaving. On the 10th day of the 8th month, although Su Fengyan had not killed anyone with his own hands, this was the first time he felt fear. Because every time Li Chungang, who was known for his peerless swordsmanship, killed someone, the chances of him losing his life would increase. If he were to stay in the Guangling River and feed the fishes, he would eventually run out of manpower. One should know that there were more than 6,000-liter army soldiers gathered near Great Yanji. They were so densely packed that it was as if they had broken into an ant's nest. Not to mention, there were also countless warships and warships of the Guangling Navy eyeing them covetously. If Zhao Yi really made up his mind to kill all of them, even if Li Chungang could bring him out alive, he would not be able to take care of Bluebird and the others. After returning to the carriage, Su Fengyan lowered his head and looked at his hands. They were trembling and could not be stopped no matter how hard he tried. There was a hint of restlessness and abnormal excitement in his heart. He had seen with his own eyes that wherever Li Chuangong's sword energy passed, a large area of flesh and blood would be badly mutilated. He asked himself, when in his life would he have the ability to fight against thousands of soldiers and horses as a mere warrior? After leaving Guangling, Li Chuangong's face immediately turned yellow, like a lamp that had run out of oil. How could Su Fengyan not know that the old god of swords had regarded the battle at the riverbank as the final battle of his life before he struck? Only the sages of the 3 sects could borrow the profound principles of the heaven and earth to defeat 1,000 caddies with little effort. For warriors who were not from the 3 sects, even if they were as strong as Li Chungang, they would have to exhaust a great amount of qi with each strike. Especially under the situation where the cavalry kept charging like a flood, they did not give the old man a chance to take a breather. This was the root of the problem. The 9 swords of the Wu family's sword tomb had killed tens of thousands of cavalry. Those were the 9 great swordsmen of the Wu family at their peak, and the 9 of them could rely on each other. However, Li Chungang had to face thousands of cavalry alone. The Ling Beikui army was undoubtedly the most elite force in the southeast of the empire. How could the 9 ancestors of the Wu family compare to Li Chuangong's ability to break 2,600 armor in a short hour? Su Fengyan raised his head and looked at the green and white lawn in the sky. He knew that Lu Qiu'er was rushing over with the Bailiang cavalry. Li Chungang slowly got off the carriage and walked to his Royal Highness's side. He asked, "What's wrong? You don't want this old man to send you to the city gate of Liangzhou?" Su Fengyan shook his head and smiled. "Forget it. Chu Lushan has already brought troops to welcome me. There's no need to trouble you, senior." The old man in the sheepskin coat pretended to be surprised. He rolled his eyes and said, "Little Su, how did your conscience, which was eaten away by dogs, come back?" Su Fengyan could only smile bitterly. Li Chungang smiled and said, "This old man accompanied you in your madness by the Guangling River. In the end we are still standing here alive. In fact, you and this old man do not owe each other anything. Without you, even if this old man killed another 2,000 cavalry, he would still have to obediently die. His ending may not be better than the Sword Emperor of Shishu. Your words are more powerful than this old man's hundreds and thousands of swords. It can be seen that the anger of an ordinary man is far inferior to the anger of a king, let alone the anger of a heavenly king. This old man can be considered to have seen through that the people of Jianghu should behave themselves in Jianghu. Otherwise, no matter how capable they are, they will not be able to distinguish between gratitude and grudges. The people of Jianghu will know each other in Jianghu. This is the right thing to do. You emperors, generals, ministers, and rich families are fighting and scheming against each other. Whoever gets involved will get himself into trouble. Just count with your fingers. Mount Longhu and Dongyue Sword Lake seem to be in power, but aren't they all turtles in a jar and carps in a pond? One day when they are fattened up, they may be steamed or braised as they please. This old man looks around and only Wudong and the Wu family are decent. Su Fengyan's face was filled with unconcealable sadness. Li Chungang glanced at him. He knew that mentioning Mount Wudong had hit His Royal Highness's soft spot. Unable to bear it, he changed the topic and asked, "In Guangling you even dared to cut off the fat meat of Zhaogo and put it into your bowl." This old man was amazed by Qin Yu's beauty. "Are you willing to spit out the meat in your mouth into the big bowl in the capital?" Su Fengyan calmly said, "It's probably still the same sentence. There are things to do and there are things not to do. Everything in the world can't just go according to my whims. First there was the threat of Zhaogo, who was almost destroyed by Cao Chongqing. Then the Empress personally sent people to me with the Empress's decree. She beat me with the stick and then gave me the date using both the carrot and the stick. What can I do? If it weren't for the Guangling River incident, perhaps I would still have the courage to act shamelessly in front of the Empress. In Xiangfan I almost completely fell out with the king of Jing and Zhao Heng. I even kidnapped his princess consort to Bailiang and formed an enmity with the king of Guangling, Zhao Yi. It's a dead knot that even the immortals can't undo. Right now I reckon that Su Xiao is ready to beat me with a broom. If I cause more trouble for him, even the Empress will have a bad impression of me as not being able to see the big picture. I'm afraid that I won't even be able to enter the house. The matter of Princess Sui Zhu has already caused this woman, who is known to be the first in the harem, to feel resentment. To tell the truth, I would rather be seen as unreasonable by the one sitting on the dragon throne than let this one worry about me again and again. When a woman's heart is ruthless. Speaking to this point, His Royal Highness suddenly shut his mouth. Li Chungang stretched his back and twisted his neck. He didn't take it to heart and laughed. It's widely rumored in Jianghu that there's going to be a reassessment of the martial arts rankings. This time they're going to dig out those deep-water bastards like Zhao Xuansu and dry them under the sun. Moreover, they're not going to be ranked based on their level of cultivation, but rather their methods of killing. It's a pity that the originally deserving number one in the world, the Wudong sect leader surnamed Hong, has already committed suicide. Otherwise, Wang Xinji would be even more deserving of being number two in the world. As for this old man, I reckon that by virtue of the battle in Guangling, he'll be ranked ahead of Dong Tai. Furthermore, this old man asserts that Gu Jiantang, who has always been looked down upon by Jianghu, won't be able to hold back this time. There's an 80 to 90% chance that he'll be able to enter the top 5. However, all of this has nothing to do with this old man. This old man has never seen a woman with so much talent. Her face is full of joy and surprise, but in fact her heart is full of sorrow and tears. She has racked her brains to seek riches and fame, but only when she opens her eyes did she realize that it was all a dream. The little girl's unintentional words are all about the disappointment of the world. Li Chungang exhaled a long breath. This old man can probably hold on for a few more years. In the future, if little girl Jiang succeeds in swordsmanship and wants to fight with you, don't criticize this old man in your heart. Su Fengyan smiled warmly and said, "If I can cultivate a female land immortal earlier, wouldn't I be able to meet her earlier? Otherwise, with her shallow skin, how could she have the nerve to kill me? I have to thank you for this." Li Chungang nodded and said with a smile, "Let's not talk about other things. Your magnanimity suits this old man's taste very well." The old man with the sheepskin fur coat had sharp ears. When he heard the horse hooves coming from afar, he sighed softly, "Little Su, after today, there is no possibility of meeting again in the martial world. Does this old man have anything that you want? Let me hear it. This old man will make an exception this time." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Old man, what can you have? The two-sleeve green snake has already taught you. I can't learn the sword will of opening the gate of heaven with the sword. If you want to talk about what's left, this tattered sheepskin fur coat that is older than me? Forget it, I won't send you off." Li Chungang picked his ears casually and took a deep look at His Royal Highness. He smiled and said, "That's the best. This old man can't stand those sentimental sentiments. The old man walked slowly on the official road with his hands behind his back. After 100 steps, he seemed to know that His Royal Highness was watching him. He didn't turn around and waved his hand. Su Fengyan stretched out his hand to block the setting sun and pursed his lips tightly. Wooden horse ox. Fingdu green robe. Sword deity. A sword came from the Great Snow Plateau. Martial Emperor City opened the gate of heaven with the sword. Guangling River had killed 2,600 cavalry. And the one-armed old man wearing the sheepskin fur coat. They were already a ray of afterglow in the martial world. Su Fengyan murmured, "One person can make the entire martial world feel old. This is really a domineering skill. Old man, I can't reward you." Chapter 358. Under the iron hooves of the Su family, how could the 8 kingdoms remain unscathed? Those who had not experienced the smoke and fire of war might not necessarily take this old saying seriously. Bailiang's 300,000 iron cavalry were elite and powerful. They could hear their voices before they even saw their faces. The sound of their horses thundering on the official road was so orderly that it made people's hearts tremble. Soon after, they could see a flag with the word, Su, gradually rising from the ground at the end of the road. It was a simple word Su, written with strong strokes and silver hooks. It was rumored that it was written by a woman. When Princess Jingyan finally saw the 2 black-armored cavalry at the front, Pei Nanwei was so nervous that her breathing subconsciously slowed down. In Xianxia City, King of Jingyan Zhou Xian had a group of elite cavalry guards. In the central region of the empire, it could be said that they could sweep through any army. When Pei Nanwei saw the thousands of cavalry charge at Guangling River, she had thought that the bravery of the world's cavalry had reached the peak. At this time, Pei Nanwei knew that there was always a higher mountain. The Phoenix Battalion, armed with sabers and crossbows, belonged to Bailiang's light cavalry. The cavalry in front of her was the Bailiang army's true iron cavalry. Their equipment was the best in the empire. The cavalry's fighting ability was second to none. As the war horses stamped their hooves, the rider on the back of the horse rose and fell. The angle of the long spear in his hand did not change in the slightest. They were 50 paces away from His Royal Highness cavalry. Almost at the same time, the horses stopped and the riders fell silent. There was no noise at all. The 2 riders shuttled forward. One of the generals was extremely handsome. He rode a white horse and held a silver spear. The other general reminded Pei Nanwei of Guangling's father and son, Zhao Yi and Zhao Yi. His movement of dismounting was not beautiful at all. It could be said that he rolled off the horse and rushed ahead of the general on the white horse. He staggered and ran with a crying voice. One on the left and one on the right. The dust created by his feet did not seem to be inferior to that of a warhorse. Pei Nanwei and the Murong siblings instantly turned pale. There were few women in the world who did not hate and fear the fat man in front of them. It was said that their faces would change at the mention of him. Even Pei Nanwei was not an exception. If she was in Xianxia City's Jing'an Palace, she would naturally be calm. However, in Bailiang, the lonely Pei Nanwei really did not have such confidence and toughness. However, the fat man who should have gone to hell to be cut into pieces and thrown into a frying pan made Pei Nanwei deeply understand what shameless flattery was. When he was still 5 or 6 steps away from His Royal Highness, his whole body suddenly fell to the ground and hugged Su Fengyan's thigh. His face was covered in tears and snot. "Your Highness is finally back. Lu Qiu deserves to die for not being able to accompany Your Highness by the Guangling River. If something happens to Your Highness, how can Lu Qiu live?" After Lu Qiu heard this, he immediately went to the general and begged for a tiger tally. He wished he could personally lead 20,000 cavalry from Liangzhou to Guangling and cut off the balls of that father and son and fry them with oil. At that time there will be countless concubines in the Guangling palace. Your Highness will first pick the good ones to warm your bed and leave the bad ones to Lu Qiu. Pei Nanwei was still fine. She could still pretend to be calm. Murong Wuzhu was so scared that her face was pale. She trembled and hid behind Murong Tonghuang. She stuck out her head, afraid that the fiendish man would sit on the ground and cry, and the next moment, he would stand up and pounce on her with a ferocious smile. She was different from Princess Jing'an. Princess Pei was the princess consort of a king with real power in the dynasty. Although she was also afraid of Chu Lushan's bad reputation, she paid more attention to the real combat strength of the Bailiang cavalry and the story behind Chu Lushan. Murong Wuzhu didn't think too much about Chu Lushan's official position and his military exploits in the spring and autumn period. Right now she wished that all the fatties in the world were lighter. Su Fengnian rubbed Chu Lushan's cheek and said helplessly, all right, we're all on the same side. Who are you pretending to be a grandson for? I'm warning you, this Shitzi doesn't have a good impression of men who weigh more than 300 catties. Why don't you try to be lovey-dovey again? Chu Lushan, who was often forgotten as the general of Qianwu Ox, struggled to get up with hidden bitterness. His Royal Highness had a smile on his face and helped him up. Fatty Chu was still muttering to himself. Su Fengnian turned his head and saw the unexpected white bear Yuan Zuozong. He said softly, "Thank you for your hard work, second brother Yuan." Yuan Zuozong, who liked to use the enemy's head as a wine bowl, squinted his eyes and shook his head. "This is my duty. Your Highness doesn't need to worry." After a pause he seemed to feel that his words were a bit stiff. Yuan Zuozong, who was always serious, smiled and joked. "Your Highness called me second brother Yuan." Yuan Zuozong walked a few hundred li comfortably. Su Fengnian let Xu Xiu give up the horse so that he could ride side by side with Chu Lushan on the official road. Aunt Xu, whose fate was much better than Lu Qiantang, had to act as a coachman. Since she left Guangling she had not had a good night's sleep. Only now did she feel at ease. In Beiliang even a dragon had to lower its head. For Beiliang there was no such thing as a dragon crossing the river. Here there was only a worm crossing the river. On the way back she received a secret message from His Royal Highness. The woman Zhao Xin kept as a mistress in Xiangfan City had died suddenly. Did this mean that she could replace her? His Royal Highness did not say anything, so she did not dare to guess. 2 dusty carriages followed closely behind. One of them was driven by Blue Bird, the head maid of Wutong Garden. She looked at the back of His Royal Highness, bit her lips and slowly lowered her eyes. On the official road His Royal Highness was in the middle. The 2 adopted sons of the King of Beiliang were on his left and right. They were all third-grade generals with the most solid military achievements in the spring and autumn period. Although Yuan Zuozong was not as famous as Qin Zhibao in Liang and Beimang dynasties, he was still better than Beimang's young generals like Ningame and Dian Xiong. Moreover, Yuan Zuozong was recognized as a first-class general in the empire. Based on this point alone there were many Yuan Baixiong in the Beiliang army. Chapter 359. The Beiliang cavalry that was a little closer to the 3 of them all kept their eyes fixed on His Royal Highness as they galloped. In the past all they had seen and heard was that His Royal Highness was jealous of other young masters and snatching women. Previously there had been no news of His Royal Highness's 3 years of travel, so they had only thought that His Royal Highness had gone to harm the girls of other places. But this time news of His Royal Highness's trip had spread back to Beiliang, causing the whole of Beiliang to be extremely shocked. Outside Xiangfan City he had single-handedly faced the king of Jing and Zhao Heng, and stabbed a general to death in front of the vassal king. Who would believe that? Later they heard that the old god of swords Li Chungang, who had somehow become His Royal Highness's retainer, had borrowed countless swords from Mount Hui in Jianzhou. The Daoist master's residence at Mount Longhu had flown into a rage out of humiliation and demanded that the old god of swords return. His Royal Highness had said, "Return my ass." This was a beautiful story that many people believed without a doubt. This was His Royal Highness's style. Speaking of this, they felt that it was absurd, but at the same time it was very satisfying. As for the recent news that Li Chungang had killed 2,600 horsemen by the Guangling River, not many people believed it to be true. But His Royal Highness had said that he would make the Beiliang swords hang all over Guangling. Almost all of the listeners had slapped the table in amazement and cheered. During this period of time, because of this sentence, Beiliang's specialty green ant wine was almost out of stock. The people of Beiliang drank to liven things up. The restaurants and taverns in the streets and alleys were booming with business. The overwhelming condemnation of His Royal Highness vanished like smoke in thin air. Some of the storytellers with good business acumen gathered information from all over the place and fabricated even more wonderful stories. As long as they talked about His Royal Highness' travels, they would win cheers from the crowd. Usually the storytellers would use up a few caddies of saliva, and the extra tips would at most be a few copper coins. But now they could earn quite a few pieces of silver every day. They spared no effort in flattering and praising His Royal Highness, who they had never met before. At first the scholars and scholars snorted disdainfully, but they couldn't stand the unanimous opinions of everyone around them. At first they were skeptical, but in the end, seeing the general trend, they had no choice but to join in the commotion. However, the Bailiang army remained unusually silent. Murong Wuzhu put down the curtain and muttered to herself, "It turns out that a great demon like Zhou Xian is also afraid of His Royal Highness." Murong Tonghuang sneered and said, "This Zhou Xian is only afraid of the king of Bailiang, who has contributed so much that he can't reward him." Murong Wuzhu frowned. She wasn't used to refuting her brother, so she lowered her voice and said, "But I feel that Zhou Xian is actually a little afraid of His Royal Highness." Murong Tonghuang hesitated and fell into deep thought. Before entering Liangzhou city, His Royal Highness sat back in the carriage and rode in the same carriage as Pei Nanwei. Princess Pei lifted a corner of the curtain and saw the people pointing at them through the gap. She sneered and said, "His Royal Highness can be shy? Crossing mountains and ridges for 3,000 miles and finally turning a bad reputation into a good one. Isn't that the original intention of His Royal Highness's trip this time?" Su Fengnian ignored the sarcasm. He folded his two swords on his knees and closed his eyes. He silently breathed according to the De Huang Ting's Heart Sutra. The red date mark between his eyebrows faded after leaving Guangling. Bailiang Palace. Pei Nanwei followed Su Fengnian down the carriage. What she didn't expect was the grand scale of the prince's mansion and the shabby welcoming party. Such a huge mansion that occupied a mountain and surrounded a lake should have countless servants. But at this time, there was only an old man who didn't have a strong body standing at the Vermilion Gate. Today was Li Dong. As the old saying goes, the water is frozen and the ground is frozen. Pheasants in the flood become clams and toads. The old man seemed to be afraid of the cold and put his hands into his thick sleeves. It seemed that after standing for a long time, the heat in his body was quickly dissipating. The old man couldn't help but shake his feet in the wind. When he saw the carriage stop, he walked over with a smile. When he saw His Royal Highness, he smiled and said some trivial things like, "You're back. Good, good, good. You look stronger. Father has asked the mansion to prepare several meat dishes, such as rolling donkey and tender ginger duck. In a year, Lidong is the best food for the body." "Hey, how come you brought so many women with you when you left Liangzhou? Could it be that you didn't bring enough money with you and those girls in Liangzhou are too shrewd and unscrupulous?" The corner of Murong Tonghuang's mouth twitched. Murong Wuzhu's eyes widened. He was at a loss. This old man couldn't be the Northern Liang prince, could he? Murong Wuzhu kept telling herself that it was absolutely not. Princess Jing'an Pei Nanwei was as shocked as Murong Wuzhu and Murong Wuzhu. But in the end she was more experienced in the ways of the world. She bowed politely, but her voice couldn't help but tremble a little. "Pei Nanwei greets Great General Su." Murong Wuzhu swallowed and instinctively took a step back. After Murong Tonghuang confirmed the identity of the old man in front of him, he waved his sleeves and prostrated himself on the ground. He put his forehead on the cold stone floor and said respectfully, "I, Murong Tonghuang from Zhenzhou, greet the king of Bailiang." Unfortunately, Su Xiao didn't even look at Princess Jing'an, who was bowing politely, and Murong Tonghuang, who was prostrating himself on the ground. The old man, whose attire was completely different from that of the first king of the dynasty, saw that his son didn't move. He rubbed his hands and put them to his mouth to blow smoke. He asked with a smile, "Are you complaining that I didn't give you enough men to kill that fat pig Zhao Yi in Guangling?" Princess Pei, who didn't feel neglected at all, twitched her eyelids. Murong Tonghuang, who didn't dare to move, trembled even more. Su Fengnian pursed his lips, which always gave people the impression of being harsh, and said calmly, "I thought you would scold me. Even if you didn't scold me, at least you wouldn't give me a good face." Su Xiao looked at his eldest son with a smile. He waved his sleeves gently and patted His Royal Highness on the shoulder. They walked to the side door together and said softly, "No one knows a son better than a father. How could I not know that you're forcing yourself to be the king of Bailiang?" Su Fengnian was silent. After entering the mansion, Su Fengnian caught a glimpse of a big celadone plate in the hands of the chief steward. There was a small porcelain bowl in it, and there was a lump of meat that didn't look fresh. In the eyes of Princess Jing'an and Pei Nanwei, the old man was more like a rich man than a butcher. He pursed his lips and said with a smile, "It was cut off from Zhao Yi's body and sent here as fast as possible." Su Fengnian was stunned. Su Xiao said slowly, "After you left Guangling, I sent someone to reason with him. He probably felt that he was in the wrong, so he cut off this piece of meat himself. Pei Nanwei had an impulse to turn around and run away. This time Su Xiao didn't smile mischievously with His Royal Highness, who he doted on the most. He only said softly, "I'm old after all. In the future you'll have to reason with others." Chapter 360. What does it mean to have a big family? When the Murong siblings walked into Bailiang Palace, they knew what it meant to be in deep water. When they saw the tide-listening lake and the martial pavilion by the lakeside, they gasped. Fortunately, the banquet was small and was not much different from the ordinary well-off merchants. His Royal Highness sat beside Su Xiao and wolfed down the food. Yuan Zuozong and Chu Lushan were also qualified to sit. One raised his cup and drank slowly while the other carefully tore the tender ginger duck meat. Ever since Murong Wuzhu walked into the palace, she had been a little absent-minded. She ate absent-mindedly and didn't dare to sit close to the chair. At the dining table, Su Xiao occasionally picked up some food for Su Fengnian with his chopsticks. During this time he whispered, "If Jihu was here, it wouldn't be father's turn to pick up the food." His Highness the Crown Prince, who had been keeping his head down, only paused for a moment before continuing to eat heartily, his cheeks bulging. After the banquet was over, the steward naturally led Princess Fei and the other guests to their accommodations. After Su Fengnian went to the Wutong courtyard to take a bath and change his clothes, he stretched his body refreshingly. Led by Sweet Potato, the orioles and swallows overflowing with spiritual aura, they saw the Crown Prince holding a winter embroidery saber in his hand. It was rare that they did not chatter. Su Fengnian smiled warmly and touched their cheeks. Then he walked out of the courtyard and came to the tide-listening pavilion. He pushed open the door and went up to the 3rd floor. He found White Fox Face, who was standing on the ladder looking for secret books. He said, "Hey." White Fox's face jumped down the long ladder. The two of them looked at each other without saying a word. The scene was neither warm nor affectionate, but it was good. Otherwise, Su Fengnian would have goosebumps all over his body if the two men looked at each other affectionately. Learning from Murong Tonghuang's mistake, Su Fengnian felt a little strange when he looked at White Fox's face. White Fox's face looked away and looked for the secret manual to fill in the gaps. Su Fengnian saw that White Fox did not want to exchange pleasantries. He had to find a topic himself and said, "I saw Qinyu. She is very beautiful. Qinyu's parents are really prophetic. Her appearance can be said to be beautiful." White Fox asked faintly, "Have you taken back Bailiang Palace?" Su Fengnian said self-deprecatingly, "No, she was abducted by an urgent imperial edict from the capital. Otherwise, I would have let that woman know that there is always a mountain beyond a mountain, a sky beyond a sky." White Fox frowned and turned to stare at His Royal Highness, who did not know how to control his mouth. The corner of her mouth lifted. There was no charm at all, but a murderous intent that sent chills down one's spine. "Hey, you think you are invincible just because you absorbed 80% of the Great Yellow Courtyard? This time you came to the arsenal in Shudong. Are you hinting me to cut you? Tell me, how many cuts will you be satisfied?" Su Fengnian slowly put Shudong behind him and smiled awkwardly. "I just want to kill the arrogance of that virtuous woman." White Fox looked at His Royal Highness, who was guilty, and asked, "Am I very close to you?" Su Fengnian seriously considered this question and then said with great sincerity, "You are not close to me, but I am very close to you. Is this okay?" White Fox turned around and smiled faintly. She said coldly, "You have a strong character. No wonder the whole Bailiang is sucking up to His Royal Highness." Su Fengnian became arrogant when he achieved success. He laughed and said, you flatter me. But I have been holding it in for many years. I have to find an opportunity to anger those scholars who are famous for scolding me." White Fox shook her head helplessly. Su Fengnian asked curiously, "When are you going to the 4th floor?" Bai Hua looked around and said, "Only in a few days." Su Fengnian sighed and said, "I don't expect to catch up to you in this lifetime." White Fox did not make fun of His Royal Highness this time. She said calmly, "What's the point of a higher state? Other than Wang Xianji, who dares to say that they can beat Li Xiaoxin, who has been in the Vajra realm? Han Diaoxi in the Imperial Palace could kill the celestial phenomenon with the mysterious finger. Most of the people in the Confucian, Buddhist and Taoist sects have an exaggerated state. If you only talk about killing enemies, you have to lower your state at least. That's why Xianyuan Jingqing on the Great Snow Plateau could only perish together with the great celestial phenomenon Xianyuan Pan. Of course, the most powerful thing about Confucian monks and Taoist monks is their mouths. They can easily enforce justice on behalf of the heavens. It's understandable that they can't fight. Su Fengnian smiled bitterly and said, "Luckily you're not a woman. Otherwise, who would dare to marry you with such a poisonous tongue?" White Fox ignored Su Fengnian's jesting and stretched out her hand. Su Fengnian hesitated and said shamelessly, "Xiu Dong and I have been relying on each other for 2 years. I have to hold her every night when I sleep. We have a deep relationship. If you don't like Xiu Dong's tackiness, why not?" White Fox did not retract her hand. She just stared at him. Murderous aura, evil spirit, domineering. This was the F*** expert who was going to fight for the top spot in Jianghu in the future. It was no wonder that old god of swords Li saw him as the future master of martial arts. At such a young age he could already regard the land immortals as his own. Su Fengnian admitted that he was 18 streets behind old god of swords Li. During this period he was separated by countless bun shops, pawn shops, restaurants and brothels. His Royal Highness, who had just been praised for his backbone, hurriedly threw Xiu Dong over and turned to climb up the stairs. White Fox took Xiu Dong's knife and tilted her head. She smiled and said nothing. Su Fengnian went to the top of the pavilion and sat upright. Li Yishan, who was so sick that he looked even more haggard than before, was writing with a stiff brush. An hour later he raised his head and said slowly, "The secret manuals of the Xianyuan family have been sorted out. The Nangong servants downstairs have used a lot of energy." While they were talking, Su Xiao came upstairs with 2 pots of wine. He sat down cross-legged and separated the 3 stacked bowls. The aroma of wine filled the air. Li Yishan did not speak as long as he had wine to drink. After drinking half a pot of green ant, which was affordable to the common people, Li Yishan was slightly tipsy. He waved his hand and asked them to leave. The father and son looked at each other and smiled. They stood up and left the roof. Li Yishan poured himself a small bowl of wine. He murmured Jiangshan, and drank it in one gulp. Then he drank beauty. He drank another small bowl with beauty. Then he drank loyalty, monarch and minister, spring and autumn, Jianghu, and Jianghu with the green ant. Finally he passed out on the table drunk. Su Fengnian and Su Xiao came to the peak of Mount Qingliang. The father and son had a secret talk. Outsiders did not know anything about it. The next morning Su Fengnian went to Mount Wudong. He sat in a daze near the Turtle Camel tablet on Little Lotus Peak. He raised his head and looked at the sky for a long time. Finally he covered his face with both hands. A few riders stealthily returned to the city. His Highness the Crown Prince went to take a look at the shop that sold spiced beef. It was already closed, so naturally he would not be able to see the little girl who kept a straight face in front of all the customers. On the 28th day of the lunar calendar, Su Fengnian replaced Su Xiao and went to Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva's dojo alone to ring 108 bells. At dusk of the Lantern Festival, every house was decorated with big red lanterns. His Royal Highness went out to relax with a few women of high status. Unexpectedly, White Fox accompanied them. They did not go to the downtown area. Instead they chose a secluded restaurant. They went to the 2nd floor and ordered some exquisite pastries. They also asked the waiter to warm a pot of yellow wine. On the 1st floor there was a pair of grandfather and granddaughter who made a living as storytellers. The blind old man was telling stories with a bamboo clapboard. The skinny little girl was sitting on a small stool and playing the pipa. The poor quality of the pipa and her poor playing skills were far from being heavenly. Not long after the blind artist sat down, His Royal Highness began to drink. He just finished a small song to warm up the atmosphere. He talked about how the king of Bailiang played the drum in white. Because the restaurant was located in a secluded area, most of the people in the city were preparing to visit the Lantern Festival. There were only a few diners on the 1st floor and the business on the 2nd floor was even worse. Su Fengnian and White Fox were drinking face to face. After thinking for a while, he waved his hand and asked the waiter to send a bowl of warm yellow wine to the grandfather and granddaughter downstairs. The wine was sent to the 1st floor. The blind old man said something to his granddaughter. The little girl stood up with her pipa and bowed to the 2nd floor. The blind old storyteller borrowed a stool from the restaurant and put the bowl of wine beside him. He raised his hand and drank a mouthful of wine excitedly. He said that it was the sound of Bailiang's horse hooves. He said that it was the sound of the spring and autumn war. Unknowingly, he ended up talking about the words His Royal Highness of Bailiang said by the Guangling River. His Royal Highness listened to the storyteller quietly drinking wine and talking with his eyes closed. He was expressionless. Perhaps it was because of her grandfather's mood. The little girl was having a hard time playing the pipa. Her face was red and her ears were red. After the blind artist came back to his senses, he reached out his trembling hand and touched his granddaughter's head. Then he reached out for the wine. He shook his hand and realized that it was empty. The old man put the bowl back and smacked his lips. It seemed that he wanted more wine, but he did not feel that it was a pity that there was no more wine. He just muttered to himself, "The old soldier of Bailiang Han Wenhu seems to have drunk out of heroism today. ## going to Baimang alone." Chapter 361. The Fish Dragon Gang could only be regarded as a third-rate gang in Bailiang, but Old Master Lu was quite famous. He was a master of both internal and external martial arts. It was said that when he was young he met a senior immortal in Wudong Mountain, who taught him a set of superior internal strength mental cultivation methods. Coupled with his 30 years of hard work, he practiced the mountain cannon fist which had been passed down by his family. Many heroes died under his fists. Unfortunately, Old Master Lu was stubborn. When he was at the peak of his fame, he couldn't lower his head to deal with the officials for fear of losing face, so he suffered a lot of difficulties. At that time, Old Master Lu could still rely on his fists and a few brothers in the gang to make a name for himself in Bailiang, which was full of gangs. However, as his old brothers earned enough money, they retired from the Jianghu and spent their remaining years with their grandchildren. Old Master Lu, who couldn't hold up the overall situation by himself, gradually found it hard to make ends meet. At this time, if he wanted to build a relationship with the officials and get a share of the gray business, he wouldn't be able to enter the temple even if he carried a pig's head. In the first 10 or 20 years, the Honghu sect and Lujian sect could only be regarded as juniors in front of the Fish Dragon Gang because they gave enough money as filial piety and were willing to put aside their pride to do a lot of dirty work for the officials. Now most of them were rich. Not to mention the gang leader, even the guests were rich. They even had private residences in big cities like Liangzhou and Lingzhou where every inch of land was worth gold. The Fish Dragon Gang finally realized this and tightened their belts, bowed their heads, and begged people to accept the filial piety money. Some of the gang's connections that had almost been completely wiped out began to improve. The destination of this trip was the lower city of the Sword southbound platform on the border of Baimang. He was helping a son of a general whose father was a 4th-grade military officer to transport some silk, satin, rouge and other goods purchased from the empire's Gangnam-do to Baimang for resale. The price difference was considerable. However, not everyone dared to do this kind of business. At this time, hundreds of lives were left on the border between the Empire and Baimang. Ordinary official travel passes might not be able to pass through the passes safely. However, since the dandy's father was a general with real power, there was no need to worry that the passes on the Bailiang side would make things too difficult for him. The only thing he was worried about was the bandits on the Baimang side. The Fish Dragon Gang gritted their teeth and accepted this business. Although they were on tenterhooks, they could only get a pitiful 10% profit. However, no matter how small a mosquito's meat was, it was still meat. Besides, being able to form a relationship with the dandy was more important than making real money. Last year, a disciple of the second leader of the Fish Dragon Gang saw the young master of the Azure Dragon Gang doing evil on the way and angrily attacked him. As a result, not only was his limbs crippled, but the Fish Dragon Gang was also almost sealed by the government. This was the difference between having a backer and not having one. During that time, the young master of the Azure Dragon Gang would often go to the Fish Dragon Gang and pester the granddaughter of the old leader, which made everyone in the gang angry. This time, the Fish Dragon Gang didn't dare to slack off in the slightest as they were working for the children of the government. Besides Lu Laozi, who stayed in the gang to intimidate the small fry who only had a few fat pieces of meat left in the gang, the second leader Xiao Chong, who was good at using a double-handed sword, had originally planned to retire in the middle of the month. Because of this, he missed the auspicious day. Even Gong Sun Yang, who hadn't been involved in the affairs of Jianghu for many years, reappeared in Jianghu with the ox horn bow. Together with Xiao Chong, he assisted Lu Narong, who was going to take over the Fish Dragon Gang in the future. There weren't too many goods, just enough to fill a carriage. If they weren't transported to Baimang, which was a primitive place, It would be very suspicious of using a big bow to shoot sparrows. As they were close to the border, thanks to the developed courier routes of the empire, the fish dragon gang had an easy time traveling these days. A woman in tight clothes with narrow sleeves was sitting on the leading horse. A long sword in a green scabbard was hanging from her waist. Her appearance was clear and charming like a femme fatale, but she had an inviolable heroic spirit. It was probably because her limpid eyes were too cold. Half a horse away, Xiao Chong rode his horse in front. Although the second leader used a double-handed sword, he didn't have one sword hanging from his waist. Instead he had two swords in one scabbard, which was very strange. Xiao Chong's swordsmanship was also very sharp and vicious. Even if there weren't 100 people killed by his sword, there were at least 70 or 80. Which Jianghu master didn't step on the lives and reputation of others. Moreover, many old-school Jianghu masters valued their reputation more than their lives. In Jianghu, revenge could be avenged for 10 generations. Every year, more and more enemies of Xiao Chong were found at the door of the Fish Dragon Gang. It could be seen that the Fish Dragon Gang was in decline. This trip to Beimang was related to the layout of the Fish Dragon Gang in the next few years. There might be enemies who would take the opportunity to attack. The spirited woman reached out her hand to block the wind and sand that was blowing at her face. She cast a glance at the top of the city wall. Even though it looked like it was close, there was still a long way to go. She said slowly, "Master, we'll reach northern Mang once we pass the pass." Although Xiao Chong's swordsmanship was outstanding and fierce, he was recognized by the whole Fish Dragon Gang to be kind and had a good temper. Moreover, the woman beside him was his last disciple. A knowing smile appeared on his face as he said in a strong Longshichong accent, "I've only been to northern Mang once in my life. Come to think of it, I don't have any praiseworthy experience." On the other hand, that taciturn Gong Sun Yang actually gained his reputation there. The extremely beautiful woman was obviously Lu Nerong, the granddaughter of old gang leader Lu. She asked in surprise, "Isn't guest Gong Sun from the old western Shu?" Xiao Chong touched the scabbard and sighed softly, "Who doesn't have a difficult scripture to read? The taciturn guy just doesn't want to talk about it." Lu Nerong turned her head and glanced at the carriage. Gong Sun Yang, who had been living in seclusion in the gang, was sitting alone in the carriage. She turned her head again and asked in a low voice, "Master, how much do you think the cost of this carriage of goods is?" Chapter 362. Xiao Chong smiled and said, "In terms of the goods themselves, even in the rich Gongnam-do, it is not cheap. Costs about 6,000 to 7,000 taels to get it. In addition, when you go to Jiangnan from Beiliang, you have to deal with all kinds of bad guys, so it is impossible to get it without 10,000 taels of silver. But if you go to Beimang, you can sell it for 35,000 taels of silver. When you get back to that official's son, after deducting all the expenses, you can't escape earning 16 or 17,000 taels of silver. This money is like a rolling snowball, always rolling bigger and bigger. As long as you have the capital, connections and background, you don't have to worry about money." These descendants of military families, while their fathers were busy collecting the wealth of the people, they weren't idle either. To be honest, these young masters aren't all idiots. When it comes to networking, 10 of these boorish men who only know how to fight and kill can't even compare to one of them. Lu Nerong sighed and said, "The Fish Dragon Gang missed the best opportunity. If they could be ruthless 20 years ago, they might be the biggest gang in Lingzhou today." Xiao Chong said helplessly, "So Nerong, don't blame the old gang leader. He tried so hard to introduce you to the son of the Lu family of Yuliang, not just because he coveted the other party's family background so that he could help the Fish Dragon Gang. The old gang leader only has one granddaughter. How could he be willing to push you into the fire pit? I have seen the young man of the Lu family with my own eyes. He is a bit arrogant, but his character is not bad. After all, he has already obtained scholarly honors. Not to mention the Fish Dragon Gang, even the daughter of the biggest sect in Beiliang, the Dragon Gate sect, may not be good enough for him. Although what I said is unpleasant to hear, it is the truth." Lu Nerong was silent and pursed her lips tightly. Xiao Chong knew that his disciple was cold and indifferent. Once she went into a dead end, even 10 horses would not be able to pull her back, so he did not force her. After all, this was the Lu family's private matter. He was an old man who was about to leave the martial arts world to enjoy his life, so he did not overdo it. But Xiaochang knew that whether his life would be comfortable and stable in the future would be directly linked to the power of the Fish Dragon Gang. Naturally, he hoped that Lu Nerong could marry into a good family. 20 years ago, the Lu family of Yuliang was just a poor family. Although they were rich, not to mention the big families, even the small families had to look down on them. But they took the opportunity to get on good terms with a powerful figure in the Bailiang army, and rose in the smoke of war. The Bailiang army was a towering tree with its roots intertwined. The Lu family was a small family. But of course, compared to the top 10 families, of the family, there was still a big family. Of the Lu family. But how could Lu Nerong, a woman of Jianghu, be able to associate with those prestigious and influential indescribable noble clans? Lu Nerong remembered something and exhaled deeply. With a fascinated face she said, "Master, I heard that the new leader of Wudong is the reincarnation of an immortal, who once rode a crane to Jiangnan. Also, old god of Swordly fought with Wang Xianji on the East Sea of the martial emperor city. Later he killed 2,600 cavalrymen on the Guangling River with only one sword. Then the peach blossom sword god Dong Tai went to the Taoist master's mansion alone and did not stop until he was stopped by Xiao Lu Zuki Xianxia and a descendant of the Taoist master's mansion. Is this true?" When Xiaochang heard this, his face was also full of reverence. He smiled and said, "I have never seen any of these immortal figures in my life, so how can I know if it is true or not? As for the flying sword, although I have been practicing the sword for 30 years, I have not even scratched the surface of flying swords, so I am even more confused. But I would rather believe that the two gods of sword are immortals on earth who can ride their swords from 1,000 miles away to take a head. In any case, it gives us, the slow-witted juniors who also carry swords, a beautiful thought. Just like how we cannot afford to eat the delicacies in the Bailiang Palace, just thinking about it can make us salivate." Xiaochang laughed loudly and Lu Nerong's eyes were shining. Lu Nerong caught a glimpse of a young man beside her from the corner of her eye, and she frowned subconsciously. This young man was dressed in clean clothes and had a simple sword on his waist. Lu Nerong only knew that he was sent by the heir of a general's family, but did not reveal his identity in detail. He was responsible for supervising the transportation of goods, and his job was probably to keep an eye on them. He was afraid that the Fish Dragon Gang, who had never seen the world, would secretly steal some inconspicuous but expensive small things from the piles of goods. How could the proud Lu Nerong like him? The appearance and bearing of the young man with the saber were not bad. The dozens of robust members of the Fish Dragon Gang were not stupid enough to think that he was just an odd-job worker from a fourth-ranked general's mansion. After all, he was someone who could accompany the Fish Dragon Gang to northern Mang. Along the way there were many guesses. Some said that he was the son of a certain steward in the strict general's mansion. Some said that he was a distant relative of the general who had received training and came here to gain experience. But more people viciously thought that this embroidered pillow, who was so good-looking that it made people jealous, was the lover of the general's son. Hey, who could say for sure about the affairs of a rich and noble family? How could there be any lack of dirty secrets and scandals? Lu Nerong's mind was clear, so of course she didn't understand why the gang members were looking at the young man with such a playful expression. In any case, the past 10 days had been peaceful. Since that person didn't cause any trouble, she naturally wouldn't find trouble with him. She had privately asked her master Xiaochang about this unfamiliar man's martial arts skills. Xiaochang only said that he couldn't tell, so she was relieved. Most likely he was a bored person who used his saber as an accessory. In any case, the rich and powerful young people all liked this kind of thing. They were obviously weaker than scholars who had no strength to truss up a chicken, yet they liked to carry a saber and a sword. The man with the sword kept a clear distance from the Fish Dragon Gang. Seeing Lu Nerong's peeping gaze, he responded with a smile. Lu Nerong turned her head with a cold face. Chapter 363. The young man with the saber stood out from the crowd, so the dozens of elite members of the Fish Dragon Gang naturally regarded him as a government official. At first, some of the younger members of the gang were worried that Miss Lu would look at this handsome young man in a different light, which would be too embarrassing for them who had been close to her for many years. Of course, they were vigilant and wanted to tie him up. Later, when they saw Lu Nerong's cold attitude, they felt relieved. At first, their malicious criticism of the young man with the saber also faded away. After all, it takes two to clap. Besides, if they kept making fun of him, they would appear to be narrow-minded. Fortunately, this young man who claimed to be surnamed Su did not order the fish dragon gang around because of his power. The two sides minded their own business and went to the border between Bailiang and Beimang. Tuma Pass was built against the mountain and was located at the main shortcut between the north and the south. The plaque was written by the calligraphy master Song Jiqiu of the current dynasty. Merchants came and went in an endless stream. The markets on both sides of the gate were very lively. There were few soldiers here, so compared to most of the border cities, the atmosphere was much less austere. There was the ruins of an old city tower which was built with rubble and goose eggs. The cracks were covered with moss and the debris was messy. Many children who lived near the city were chasing and playing on the tower. A strong man wearing a blue cotton shirt with a red cloth belt around his waist stared at them. He carried a huge saber that was much simpler than the standard military saber. The tip of the saber cut the ground and he went up the platform aggressively. He snorted, stabbed the saber into the ground and stood there with his arms crossed. The adults hurriedly and carefully went around the strong man to grab their children off the platform. A naughty child was as slippery as a loach. The child's mother looked to be in her early 20s. The wind and sand at the border were rough, but the young woman's skin was like oil. She had a slim waist and small feet, but she could not catch up with the naughty child. The merchants and the local people under the platform laughed. Some of the old rascals who had not had a woman to warm their bed gathered together to eat red dates. They even spat out dates and teased the young woman. The young woman's face turned red. The child passed by the strong man with the saber. The newborn calf was not afraid of tigers and reached out to touch the saber. However, the strong man glared at him fiercely. He was so scared that he froze on the spot and then burst into tears. The young woman wearing plain clothes quickly hugged the child and looked at him apologetically. She was so timid that she did not dare to speak. The black-faced man in his 30s blushed for no reason. He was probably a young chick who was rough but also delicate. Seeing the young woman in front of him, the image of an expert that he had created with great difficulty with a straight face was instantly broken. The rascals in the marketplace became even more rowdy and rowdy. On this dilapidated platform, every 10 days to half a month, there would be Jianghu people competing in martial arts. Although Little Miss was a girl from a proper family, she had lived in the village near Tuma Pass for many years and had seen a lot. She was not too afraid of these boorish men who would draw their swords at the slightest disagreement. Northern Liang was barren and cold. Compared to the rich and fertile Jiangnan, which had 1,000 li of fertile land, if one wanted to survive, one had to dig out food from the gaps between the teeth of the heavens to eat. The customs of the people were simple, but at the same time, they were unusually brave and worshipped martial arts. The government did not forbid private fights between martial artists, but if one accidentally injured a commoner, it was a great crime to be banished to the army. If there were more than 3 people, they would be punished on the spot. Without at least 100 taels of silver as a filial piety to the soldiers, they would not be able to survive. With the support of his mother, the child carelessly wiped the tears off his little black cat face and made a face at the brawny man. The brawny man who was about to fight scratched his head helplessly. Clearly he was not a vicious and evil person. The child had originally wanted to stretch out his leg to kick this stingy piece of charcoal that wouldn't even let him touch the knife. Fortunately, his mother hurriedly pulled him away and gently scolded him. The dark-faced brawny man seemed to be looking straight ahead, but from the corner of his eye, his gaze landed on the buttocks of the little girl that was slightly bent over. His Adam's apple bobbed slightly. The girl's body was small and delicate, her clothes were plain and clean. Probably because she had been washed many times, adding on to the fact that her buttocks were too perky compared to her body, it was difficult for her to stretch her full breasts. She appeared even more beautiful. It wasn't that the brawny man with the Zamadeo had evil intentions. He did have some skills, but he disdained to be a heartless flower thief. If it was shady business like robbing women, he was a wandering soul of the Jianghu with no roots and no background. He definitely did not have the capital to do it. As for traveling, what could he do without money? Today he had an appointment with a somewhat famous swordsman on the border. He wanted to use the Zamadeo to make some reputation even if he was injured, so that some rich people would take a fancy to him. It would be best if he could become a guard instructor. Xiao Chong went to take the goods and show the official pass to the captain of the pass. The king of hell was easy to deal with, but the little ghosts were difficult to deal with. They would definitely not pass the pass in a short time. This matter should have been handled by Lunarong, but she was very attractive and could easily cause problems. Xiao Chong did not care and insisted on letting the granddaughter of the gang gain experience and accumulate worldly wisdom. If a carriage of goods had a problem, the Fish Dragon gang could barely afford to pay for it. However, if they angered that famous young master, they would really suffer a great loss. Therefore, he simply did not let Lunarong show up. Lunarong wandered around with a few attendants and agreed to meet her master Xiao Chong at the city gate in half an hour. Lunarong wanted to take advantage of this trip to recruit 1 or 2 Jianghu heroes to join the gang. If she really wanted to take over the Fish Dragon gang, she would not be able to raise her head if she did not have any of her own subordinates. Moreover, it would not be good to have her hands and feet tied. She and 6 or 7 young members of the Fish Dragon gang followed the crowd to the base of the platform. A few local gangsters who wanted to get close to her were gently pushed away by Lunarong's escorts. They were all skillful and made people retreat. After all, this was not Lingzhou. If they provoked someone difficult to deal with, who would give face to the Fish Dragon gang that they had never heard of? How big was the Jianghu today? A half-baked Jianghu person who had been in the Jianghu for a few years could casually name a lot. The so-called sects, gangs, temples, villages, islands, villages, palaces, and so on, not to mention other places. Just in Lingzhou alone, there were more than 40 people who could name themselves. To put it bluntly, it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens to be able to give a good name. The Fish Dragon gang was considered to have started their business early, so they were able to snatch the name Fish Dragon, which was not vulgar. Outside of Lingzhou, the whole Jianghu probably had at least 8 or 9 members of the Fish Dragon gang with the same name.